In the early 1930s, Germany still carried the weight of the First World War and the economic collapse that followed. Factories stood idle. Unemployment climbed into the millions. Political parties fractured parliament into competing factions that stalled legislation and eroded confidence in democratic governance. Into this environment stepped a movement promising restoration of national power, rearmament, and employment programs measured in factories reopened, and infrastructure projects stretching across hundreds of miles. Within a few years, the German state began rebuilding military capacity. Shipyards constructed submarines, displacing hundreds of tons. Aircraft factories assembled fighters with engines producing over 1,000 horsepower. Tank designs evolved from light vehicles, weighing less than 10 tons, into armored machines exceeding 20 or 30 tons. Rearmament consumed steel measured in thousands of tons, and fuel reserves stored in massive depots across the country. The transformation from weakened republic to militarized dictatorship did not occur quietly. Political opposition fractured under repression. Propaganda ministries broadcast messages through radio networks, reaching millions of households. Youth organizations trained generations to see military service as inevitable. The machinery of the state recalibrated itself toward expansion and control. When war erupted in September 1939, with the invasion of Poland, German armies advanced with coordination between tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Panzer divisions, supported by dive bombers, struck positions with bombs weighing several hundred pounds each. Artillery fired shells exceeding 20 pounds toward defensive lines. Supply columns moved forward, carrying fuel measured in hundreds of tons to sustain rapid movement. Inside a panzer tank during those early campaigns, the crew felt the metal hull vibrate under the power of its engine, while radio operators transmitted coordinates between units. The concept of fast-moving combined arms warfare fractured opposing defenses before they could stabilize. Poland fell within weeks. France followed the next year, after armored thrusts advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of days. For a moment, the Reich appeared unstoppable. German forces occupied territories across Europe, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. Industrial output increased dramatically. Factories produced aircraft, tanks, artillery, and ammunition by the thousands. Rail networks carried supplies across conquered regions. Fuel reserves measured in millions of gallons sustained operations across multiple fronts, yet expansion carries weight. Each occupied territory required garrisons numbering in the tens of thousands. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of road and rail. Fuel convoys transported gasoline needed for armored units, whose engines consumed dozens of gallons per hour during sustained operations. Administrative control demanded bureaucracies, soldiers, and police forces operating simultaneously. The war widened further in 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Over 3 million soldiers advanced across a frontier, spanning nearly 2,000 miles. Thousands of tanks and aircraft supported the assault. Early encirclement battles captured Soviet soldiers in numbers exceeding 300,000 in single operations. Cities burned. Front lines shifted rapidly eastward. But geography does not surrender quickly. The Soviet Union relocated factories weighing dozens of tons of machinery beyond the Ural Mountains. Industrial output resumed far from German bombers. Tanks such as the T-34 rolled off assembly lines in quantities measured in tens of thousands over the war. At the same time, the United States entered the conflict after December 1941, bringing industrial capacity capable of producing aircraft, ships, and vehicles in enormous numbers. When I once compared wartime production statistics across nations involved in the conflict, the imbalance became unmistakable. German factories produced thousands of aircraft and tanks annually. Allied factories produced many times that number. Steel, aluminum, aviation fuel, and manpower accumulated on one side faster than the other could destroy them. The tide shifted visibly at several critical battles. At Stalingrad, a German army of over 200,000 soldiers became encircled and eventually surrendered after months of combat and starvation. At Kursk, thousands of tanks collided across prepared defensive lines, where minefields and artillery fire stalled German armored thrusts. Losses mounted faster than replacements could arrive. Inside a German factory during the later years of the war, workers assembled aircraft engines while Allied bombers approached overhead. Bomb loads weighing thousands of pounds struck industrial districts, rail yards, and fuel plants. Synthetic fuel facilities, essential for aviation gasoline, fractured under repeated bombardment. Without fuel, aircraft and tanks could not operate, regardless of how many were produced. The Reich fought simultaneously across multiple fronts. In the east, Soviet armies advanced westward, with artillery barrages firing thousands of shells. In the west, Allied forces landed in Normandy and deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, supported by thousands of vehicles and aircraft. In the south, battles across Italy consumed additional divisions. Every month, the numbers tightened. German divisions once fielding 15,000 soldiers, sometimes reported fewer than half that number available for combat. Aircraft units lost experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them. Fuel shipments dwindled as bombing campaigns struck refineries and transport routes. Imagine a German officer studying a map late in 1944. The front lines that once advanced outward now shrink inward. Reports arrive listing tanks destroyed, aircraft lost, rail lines severed. Requests for reinforcements collide with empty depots. The arithmetic that once favored expansion now works against survival. The end came in 1945, as Allied armies approached from both east and west. Soviet forces fought street by street through Berlin. Artillery shells exploded among buildings already shattered by bombing. Tanks advanced across Rubble, while infantry cleared rooms one by one. The capital that once directed a continent-wide war became a battlefield itself. When I look at photographs of Berlin from those final weeks, I sometimes pause longer than expected. The city appears less like a center of power and more like a field of broken concrete and twisted steel. It reminds me how quickly systems built for expansion can collapse under sustained pressure. And if you are listening now, while the room grows quiet, imagine the arc of those years like a long road, beginning with rallies and promises of strength, then stretching through columns of tanks, factories burning through the night, and finally ending in streets where the engines of war fall silent. This is the entire history of the rise and fall of the Third Reich in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Invoice for a World. The 28th of June, 1919. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Outside, the formal gardens are immaculate, the fountains switched off to save the expense of running them. Inside, the air is close and warm. Too many bodies in an ornate room designed for spectacle, not for governance. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a German delegation is waiting to sign a document that most of them have not been permitted to negotiate. Hermann Müller, the German foreign minister, notes in his private correspondence that the delegation was made to enter through a side entrance, a small choreography of humiliation that the organizers had arranged with some care. The hall itself was chosen deliberately. It was here, in 1871, that the German Empire had been proclaimed after crushing France in the Franco-Prussian War. History, the Allied planners understood, has an architecture. They used it. What I find consistently underweighted in accounts of Versailles is not the famous Article 231, the war guilt clause, but the financial annex that followed it. The reparation schedule was not a single number, cleanly stated. It was a layered instrument, built in tiers, with a structure so complex that the German treasury could not calculate its final obligation for more than 2 years after signing. The London Schedule of Payments, issued in May 1921, eventually set the headline figure at 132 billion gold marks, a sum that the economist John Maynard Keynes, who had been present as a British Treasury delegate, had already called unworkable. Keynes had resigned from the British delegation in protest before the treaty was finalized. He published his findings in December 1919 in a book titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and every major Allied government read it. His argument was not emotional, it was actuarial. He showed, with the tools of a trained economist, that the payment schedule was structurally impossible, given Germany's post-war productive capacity. The book became a bestseller. The treaty stood unchanged. The specific mechanism of the reparations impossibility is worth sitting with, because it is the engine of everything that follows. The treaty demanded payment in gold marks, the pre-war currency unit, pegged to actual gold reserves. Germany's post-war paper currency, the Papiermark, was explicitly not convertible to gold. The Reichsbank's only available strategy was to print paper marks, use them to purchase foreign currencies on the open market, then use those foreign currencies to buy gold, and deliver that gold as payment. Each stage of this process weakened the paper mark further. The more Germany attempted to pay, the more its currency degraded. The Reichsbank's own directors understood that the process was self-accelerating. They saw no alternative. This is not a historical footnote. It is the specific financial mechanism that produced the hyperinflation of 1922 and 1923, which destroyed the savings of the German middle class, which created the political audience for a certain kind of demagogue, which is why the bond between the Versailles Treaty Room and the later catastrophe is not rhetorical, it is mechanical. There was also the matter of coal. Under Article 235 of the Versailles Treaty, Germany was required to deliver 44 million tons of coal annually to France, Belgium, and Italy, not as payment against the reparations total, but in addition to cash reparations. In 1920 and 1921, Germany delivered roughly 60% of the required tonnage. The shortfall triggered the Franco-Belgian military occupation of the Ruhr industrial region in January 1923, Germany's industrial heartland, occupied by foreign troops in peacetime, to enforce a debt payment. The German government responded by calling a general strike in the Ruhr. The workers stopped. The coal stopped. The Reichsbank printed more marks to pay the striking workers' wages. The currency spiral accelerated beyond anything the 19th century economic playbook had language for. By November 1923, the exchange rate had reached 130 billion paper marks to a single American dollar. A Munich baker, whose diary is cited in Richard Evans' The Coming of the Third Reich, records that a single loaf of bread cost 3 billion marks that week. He does not editorialize. He simply records the number, and then the next number, and then the next, with the flat resignation of a man who has stopped being surprised by arithmetic. When I was working through the sequence of events between Versailles and the hyperinflation, what struck me was not the scale of the economic catastrophe. Historians have described that in adequate detail, but the speed of institutional confidence collapse. The German middle class did not gradually become radicalized over years. They experienced the destruction of their savings in a matter of months. A dentist in Frankfurt who had deposited 10,000 marks in 1921, a solid, respectable sum representing years of professional work, found that the same account balance by late 1923 could not purchase a postage stamp. The moral contract between the German state and its professional classes, the implicit promise that prudence, savings, and civic participation would be rewarded, was voided in a single inflationary spiral. What replaced it was a political audience primed to believe that the system itself was the enemy. They weren't entirely wrong about the system. That's what makes the subsequent history so difficult to hold. The Dawes Plan of 1924 temporarily stabilized the situation. American banker Charles G. Dawes restructured Germany's debt schedule and arranged a series of American commercial loans to support the German economy. For roughly 5 years, 1924 to 1929, the Weimar Republic functioned with a degree of stability. Cultural life flourished. The economy recovered. A private cable from the J.P. Morgan offices in New York to the U.S. State Department, dated October 1924, warned that German economic stabilization was contingent upon a political stability that we cannot guarantee. That cable was filed. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash ended the American lending that had been quietly underwriting the Weimar recovery, and the German unemployment rate climbed from roughly 1.5 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. The Weimar Republic had been living on borrowed American capital. When the capital was withdrawn, the stability went with it. What the historical record shows, and what I think gets lost in narratives that focus on Hitler's rhetoric, is that the Nazi Party's electoral breakthrough in 1930 to 1932 was not primarily a response to his speeches. It was a response to a material crisis that the established parties were visibly failing to address. The NSDAP's vote share rose from 2.6% in the May 1928 election to 18.3% in September 1930, to 37.4% in July 1932. That trajectory tracks almost precisely with the unemployment curve. The audiences at the rallies weren't there because they had developed a sudden enthusiasm for racial ideology. A significant portion of them were there because they were desperate, and desperation makes an audience willing to listen to anyone who offers a coherent explanation for the chaos. The explanation Hitler offered was false, vicious, and wrong. but it was offered with certainty, in a moment when certainty itself had become the rarest commodity in Germany. The international response to Germany's economic crisis in the early 1930s tells you almost everything you need to know about the political will of the democratic powers. France maintained its hard line on reparations payments, even as German unemployment numbers were published monthly, and German political extremism was documented weekly in every major newspaper. Britain pursued a policy it called revision, acknowledging that the Versailles terms were too harsh while not actually changing them. The United States, having withdrawn its commercial lending and retreated behind the Smoot-Hawley tariff wall of 1930, was functionally absent from European economic management. Keynes continued to write and lecture. His warnings were, by the early 1930s, no longer predictions. They were descriptions of things actively occurring. They were still not acted upon. The financial architecture of Versailles held its shape until the political structure it had undermined finally gave way beneath it. The Weimar Republic's last election before Hitler's appointment was held in November 1932. The NSDAP had actually lost votes in that election, dropping from 37% to 33%, suggesting the peak of the Nazi electoral wave had passed. The Republic might, conceivably, have survived. What ended it was not a popular revolution, but a backroom arrangement, a coalition of conservative establishment figures, Franz von Papen chief among them, who believed they could appoint Hitler as chancellor and control him from within the cabinet. Papen reportedly told a colleague that Hitler would be squeezed until he squeaks. It is one of the most catastrophically misjudged political calculations in modern history. On the 30th of January, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, the 85-year-old field marshal who had commanded Germany in the First World War, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of the German Reich. The establishment's confidence in its own ability to manage the situation lasted approximately 60 days. The treaty room at Versailles is now a museum attraction. Tourists photograph themselves in front of the Hall of Mirrors' gilded ceiling. The financial annex, the document with the handwritten correction that added 2 billion gold marks to Germany's obligation, sits in an archival folder at Kew. Keynes' resignation letter is catalogued. The Reichsbank exchange rate bulletins from November 1923 are digitized and publicly accessible. The entire sequence of documents exists, complete, cross-referenced, and legible. What they record is a failure not of intelligence, but of will. The failure of governing institutions to act on information they demonstrably possessed, because the political cost of revision was judged too high. The invoice they sent in 1919 was eventually paid, but not by Germany, and not in gold marks. The currency in which it was finally settled had no name in any treaty annex. Chapter 2. The Man in the Trench Coat Notebook, Vienna, 1911. The corner of a reading room in the Mennerheim men's shelter on Meldemannstrasse, in the 20th district of the city. It is a clean, functional building, designed for the respectable poor, not the destitute, with individual sleeping cubicles, a communal kitchen, and a small library room where residents could write or read in the evenings. One of the regular occupants of that reading room is a young man in his early 20s who occupies a corner table with some consistency. He draws, he writes, he reads pamphlets. His name is Adolf Hitler, and he has been living in this shelter since roughly 1910, after a period of genuine destitution during which he slept in parks and charitable dormitories. He is not famous. He is not particularly noticed. The shelter's intake register records his occupation as painter, which is partially accurate. He paints small watercolor scenes of Viennese architecture and sells them, through a Jewish art dealer named Jakob Altenberg, to tourists and small frame shops. The income is modest but sufficient. He is 22 years old, and the world has given him no particular reason to believe he matters. The Vienna watercolors that survive from this period are technically accomplished in a narrow, specific way. They render architecture with reasonable precision, the proportions of buildings, the geometry of streets, the details of imperial facades. What they do not contain, with a consistency that the art historian Brigitte Hamann noted across multiple surviving works, is human figures. The streets are empty. The trams are present, but unoccupied. The grand civic spaces that Hitler painted with evident affection and some skill are rendered as if the people had been removed from them, or had never been there. This is not universal in his work, and I'm not suggesting it is a simple biographical key. But when I look at those images alongside what came later, I find myself returning to the absence again and again. There is something in the aesthetic preference for the built environment stripped of its inhabitants that feels, at minimum, worth noticing. The two rejections from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, in 1907 and 1908, are documented in the Academy's own records. The examiner's assessment after the 1907 submission specified insufficient figure drawing as the primary deficiency, and recommended Hitler consider architecture as an alternative. This recommendation was not actionable for him, because admission to the architecture program required a school-leaving certificate that he did not possess. He had left school in Linz without completing his qualification. The architecture door was therefore technically open and practically closed simultaneously. Historians have noted the irony that the man who would later commission the most grandiose architectural project in European history was directed toward architecture by the institution that rejected his art and was prevented from pursuing it by his own academic failure. What the records don't tell you, what no document can tell you, is how a 20-year-old processes two rejections from the institution he has identified as his destiny. What they do tell you is what he did next, which was, he stayed in Vienna, he read pamphlets, and he did not apply a third time. The pamphlet literature that Hitler consumed at the Mannerheim is documented, partially, through his own later accounts and through the publication records of the primary series he mentioned. The Ostara pamphlets, produced by Georg Lanz von Liebenfels, and sold at Vienna newsstands for a few Heller apiece. The Ostara series fused theosophical mysticism with racial biology. It borrowed the typological illustration methods of legitimate academic craniometry, the skull measurement science that was being practiced in European universities in the early 20th century, and applied them to a hierarchy of racial types. The pamphlets were illustrated. They showed, in diagrams that mimicked scientific methodology, the visual grammar of racial classification. This matters because the source material for Nazi racial ideology was not simply hatred. It was hatred dressed in the vocabulary of science. The specific cognitive trick of the Ostara series was to take something genuinely barbaric and present it in the format of an academic paper. That format lent it a credibility in the reading room of the Mannerheim that naked racism could not have achieved. Hitler learned, in that corner of a Viennese reading room, that if you dress violence in the language of research, an educated audience will engage with it on the research's own terms. August Kubizek, Hitler's sole close friend from the Vienna period, published a memoir in 1953 titled The Young Hitler I Knew. It is an extraordinary and deeply unreliable document. Extraordinary because Kubizek was genuinely close to Hitler during the formative years of 1907 to 1908. Unreliable because he wrote with the hindsight of a man who survived the Third Reich and needed to manage his own association with its architect. Kubizek claims Hitler rarely spoke of Jews in the Vienna years and showed no marked anti-Semitism. Ian Kershaw's research in Hitler, Hubris, drawing on Viennese contemporaries' accounts and Hitler's own retrospective statements in Mein Kampf, contradicts this, placing the formation of his hardened anti-Semitism clearly in the Vienna period. Both sources cannot be fully accurate about the same man in the same years. What I find telling in this conflict is what it reveals about memory's relationship to comfort. Kubizek needed the young Hitler he knew to have been a different man, and so he remembered a different man. The documents don't permit that revision. Between 1908 and 1913, Hitler sold roughly 2,000 small paintings and postcard-sized views of Viennese landmarks through Altenburg's dealership and a handful of other small frames shops. The financial arrangement with Altenburg, who was Jewish, a fact Hitler never acknowledged in any subsequent account, provided him economic survival during the years he was developing the ideology that would eventually mandate Altenburg's persecution. I find myself returning to this detail not to make a simple point about hypocrisy, because hypocrisy in a 20-year-old artist is neither remarkable nor historically significant. I return to it because of what it suggests about compartmentalization, the specific human capacity to maintain a functional, even dependent relationship with a person belonging to a group one is simultaneously being taught, by pamphlet literature, to consider an existential enemy. That compartmentalization would become, later, not an individual psychological quirk, but a national administrative policy. In February 1914, Hitler appeared before an Austrian medical commission in Salzburg, having been recalled for possible conscription. The medical record, partially preserved, classified him as unfit for combat and auxiliary duty, too weak, incapable of bearing arms. He was rejected by the Austrian army. He had been living in Munich for roughly a year at this point, having left Vienna in 1913, officially to pursue work, possibly to avoid the Austrian draft, a question that the incomplete records cannot definitively settle. He returned to Munich and resumed the life of a marginal artist and political pamphlet reader. In August 1914, he was photographed in the Odeonsplatz in Munich, in the crowd celebrating the outbreak of the First World War. He can be identified in the photograph. Historians have cross-referenced it carefully. In the third row, his face upturned and apparently rapt. Within days, he had applied for and received permission to serve in a Bavarian regiment, despite being an Austrian citizen. The Austrian army had found him unfit. The Bavarian army accepted him. The gap between those two administrative decisions is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential clerical coincidences in modern history. His war record is more specific than the simplified, decorated corporal summary suggests. Hitler served primarily as a Meldeganger, a dispatch runner, carrying messages between regimental headquarters and the forward positions. It was work that brought him near the front lines, but not typically into its most lethal environment. The regimental war diaries describe him as reliable, conscientious, and notably lacking in the social bonds that most soldiers formed with their immediate comrades. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, an unusually high decoration for an enlisted man. The recommendation for the First Class decoration was submitted by his regimental adjutant, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, who was Jewish. The decoration was awarded. Gutmann emigrated in the 1930s, eventually reaching the United States. Hitler never publicly acknowledged the source of his recommendation. The Iron Cross First Class remained one of his most conspicuous medals throughout his political career. The armistice of November 1918 reached Hitler in a military hospital at Passewalk in Pomerania, where he was recovering from a temporary blindness attributed to a gas attack in October. His account of hearing the news, recorded years later in Mein Kampf and in subsequent speeches, describes a collapse into grief, following by what he characterized as a transformative political resolution. The degree to which this retrospective account accurately describes the moment, rather than constructing a politically useful origin narrative, is impossible to determine from the documentation. What is documentable is the effect. Hitler emerged from the war with a decoration, a grievance, a set of ideological frameworks absorbed from Viennese pamphlet literature, and no practical occupation. He was 30 years old. He had nothing to lose by politics, and no other obvious direction to move. The Weimar Republic, which came into being the same week as his hospital experience, would need to find a way to manage men like him. It didn't. He arrived back in Munich in early 1919, as Germany was convulsed by revolutionary politics. A short-lived Soviet-style republic had been proclaimed and then violently suppressed, and the city was awash in veterans, disbanded soldiers, political pamphlets, and the particular kind of grievance-seeking that follows a war whose end feels, to the losing side, incomprehensible. The Mannerheim reading room habits had given him a framework. The war had given him a credential. The defeat had given him a cause. Munich in 1919 was, in retrospect, the specific environment this specific man needed to transform from a marginal painter of empty streets into something considerably more dangerous. He hadn't changed. The context around him had changed, until it fit the shape he'd already grown into. Chapter 3. The Architecture of the Big Lie. Munich, early 1920. A small room above a beer hall, somewhere in the older part of the city, heated by a single coal stove, the windows fogged. The German Workers' Party, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, holds its organizational meetings here. The party had been founded in January 1919 by a toolmaker named Anton Drexler and a journalist named Karl Harrer, and by January 1920 it had registered, officially, 54 members. Someone on the executive, the record doesn't specify who, had decided the party's membership rolls should begin at number 501, not at number 1. The decision was practical in the obvious sense that a party numbered in the hundreds sounds more established than a party numbered in the 50s. It was also a lie. It was the first deliberate statistical falsification in the organization's history, and it was made before the organization had done anything of note whatsoever. Adolf Hitler, who joined in September 1919 and received membership card number 555, was thus the recorded member of a party that had inflated its apparent size from its first operational week. In this small clerical detail, a ledger number adjusted upward to impress nobody in particular, the institutional DNA of the entire Third Reich is already present. The party that Hitler joined and then rapidly came to dominate was organized around a treasurer named Franz Xaver Schwarz, whose role in the Nazi rise to power is among the most consequential and least discussed of any figure in the story. Schwarz was a former Munich municipal accountant, methodical, precise, and entirely without ideological charisma. He had no particular gift for rhetoric and no appetite for street theater. What he had was the specific professional skill of a man who knows how to make limited money behave like more money, how to maintain organizational solvency through periods of political volatility, and how to build a financial infrastructure that could survive the arrest and imprisonment of its leadership. He served as NSDAP treasurer from 1925 until 1945. In that period, he transformed a barely solvent fringe organization into the best-funded political party in Germany. He is rarely in the documentaries. He deserves better. The Nazi Party, before it was a movement, was an accounting problem that Schwarz solved. The 25-point program, announced on the 24th of February 1920 at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich, is one of the founding documents of the Nazi movement, and one of its most misunderstood. The official party account credited Hitler and Drexler as joint authors. The internal draft evidence examined by historian Reginald Phelps in the Munich City Archive suggests that significant sections, particularly the anti-interest slavery clauses in points 11 through 17, derive substantially from the economic pamphlets of Gottfried Feder, a crank economist whose ideas about the distinction between productive capital and rapacious capital provided a pseudo-intellectual framework for anti-Semitism dressed as economic critique. Hitler's own later private statements, recorded by his secretary, suggest he regarded several of the program's specific points as useful for now, rather than fixed commitments. The meeting was attended by something the party later reported as 2,000 people. Munich police surveillance records from the same evening put the figure at no more than 400. The 2,000 figure appeared in every subsequent party publication. The organizational habit of manufacturing political reality had been established within the first 6 months of operation. The acquisition of the Völkischer Beobachter newspaper in December 1920 for 180,000 marks, an enormous sum for an organization of the NSDAP's actual size at that point, is one of the more revealing financial maneuvers of the early party. The funding was assembled from multiple sources: personal loans from Dietrich Eckart, an anti-Semitic poet and early Hitler patron, contributions from Munich military circles that cannot be fully traced in surviving records, and what the Institute für Zeitgeschichte documents describe as funds from sources sympathetic to the national cause, a phrase that is the archival equivalent of a drawn shade. The paper's acquisition gave the party something no rival organization had: a dedicated, daily publishing propaganda organ that it fully controlled. Every political operation thereafter, every rally, every campaign, every arrest, every policy announcement, was interpreted, amplified, and framed through a newspaper whose editorial line was determined by the party's leadership. It manufactured the party's public reality. The 180,000 marks was the most efficient political investment the movement ever made. The beer hall putsch of the 8th and 9th of November 1923 is narrated, in most accounts, as an almost successful seizure of power brought low by bad luck and police resistance. The operational record suggests something messier. Hitler's plan, reconstructed from police reports and testimony at his subsequent trial, required the cooperation of 3 key figures: the Bavarian State Commissioner Gustav Ritter von Kahr, General Otto von Lossow of the Bavarian Reichswehr, and Colonel Hans Ritter von Seisser of the State Police, who had been pressured at gunpoint to support the putsch in the beer hall on the evening of the 8th, and who immediately repudiated their coerced agreement once they were free to act. General Erich Ludendorff, who had attached himself to the operation as its military figurehead, then committed to marching on the Bavarian War Ministry the following morning, regardless, apparently under the impression that his personal prestige would cause the police to stand aside rather than fire. He was wrong. At the Feldherrnhalle, Police fire killed 16 of the marching party. By Hermann Göring's own trial testimony, Hitler, who was marching in the second rank, fell to the ground when the shooting started, his shoulder dislocated, by one account, by being pulled down by the man beside him. Göring was wounded. Ludendorff, who did not fall, later made pointed references to the contrast in behaviors. The putsch failed in approximately 90 seconds of gunfire. What happened to Hitler at the subsequent trial is one of the most instructive episodes in the entire story of the Third Reich's rise, and I find it continues to be underweighted relative to its actual political significance. He was tried for high treason before a Bavarian court in February and March of 1924. The presiding judge permitted him unlimited time to speak. He spoke for approximately 4 hours in his closing address. The speech, delivered without notes, with extraordinary rhetorical organization, was transcribed and distributed as a pamphlet within days. Early radio coverage of the trial carried excerpts to an audience that extended well beyond Munich. The judge sentenced Hitler to the minimum permissible term of 5 years, with immediate eligibility for parole after 6 months, to be served at Landsberg prison in comfortable private accommodation, with visiting hours, permitted correspondence, and the use of a personal secretary. He was released after approximately 9 months, having dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf to his secretary Rudolf Hess. The Bavarian justice system had provided, at public expense, the national platform, the time, the accommodation, and the secretarial support for the political rehabilitation of a man convicted of violent treason. The failure was not accidental. Sympathetic conservative judges, a culture that regarded nationalist violence as categorically different from ordinary criminality, and an establishment that still believed Hitler could be used, all contributed. The infrastructure of complicity was already in place before the regime required it. When I work through the organizational mechanics of the NSDAP's growth between 1925 and 1932, I keep returning to the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, not as an ideological abstraction, but as a specific organizational technology. Hitler had forced a constitutional amendment into the NSDAP's structure in July 1921 that abolished all party committees and replaced them with appointed leaders, holding authority downward and owing absolute loyalty upward. The practical effect was an organization that made decisions at the speed of a single man's will, rather than the speed of committee deliberation. In a democracy of competing parties, this created a structural asymmetry. The NSDAP could pivot, respond, and mobilize faster than any organizational competitor. The Weimar parties, the Social Democrats, the Catholic Center, the Liberal parties, all operated through genuine committee structures, which meant genuine debate, which meant genuine delay. In a period of fast-moving economic and political crisis, the party that could react in hours had an advantage over parties that needed days. The Führerprinzip was not merely an expression of authoritarian ideology. It was a competitive organizational advantage in the specific market of early 1930s German democratic politics. Party Treasurer Schwarz's internal financial memoranda, examined at the Institute for Zeitgeschichte, show that dues collection ran at roughly 23% efficiency across the membership rolls by the early 1920s, meaning the party's actual operating income was dramatically below what the membership numbers implied. The organization was financially a fiction for much of its early existence, sustained by donations from sympathetic industrialists, personal loans from wealthy backers, and the meticulous management of Schwarz's accountant's discipline. By 1932, however, the NSDAP had become the largest political party in Germany by registered membership, with a national organizational infrastructure of regional offices, a publishing empire, a paramilitary wing, and a treasury that had achieved genuine solvency. The transformation from a Munich beer hall operation with 54 real members to a national movement with nearly 1 million registered members took roughly 12 years. It required, in roughly equal parts, rhetorical talent, financial management, organizational discipline, and the sequential failures of the republic it was trying to destroy. The conservative establishment's calculation that Hitler could be controlled from within a cabinet, squeezed until he squeaks, as Papen reportedly phrased it, deserves to be taken seriously as a genuine political assessment rather than dismissed as simple stupidity. The men making it were not stupid. They had watched European politics for 30 years. They had seen populist movements co-opted, absorbed, and defanged by the machinery of coalition government in multiple democratic contexts. Their error was not in the general theory of political absorption. The theory was sound. Their error was in misjudging the specific organizational technology of the NSDAP, which had been built precisely to resist absorption. The Führerprinzip meant there were no internal coalition partners to peel away. The loyalty structure meant there were no faction leaders to negotiate with. The organization had been engineered, from 1921 onward, to be immune to the co-optation strategy that the establishment's political experience told them would work. By the time this became apparent, it was January 1933, and the appointment had already been made. The exact number of NSDAP members at the moment of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, on the 30th of January, 1933, is given in party records as approximately 850,000. Within a year, it would exceed 2.5 million, as the party opened its rolls to opportunists, careerists, and the institutionally frightened who wished to position themselves correctly in the new order. Franz Xaver Schwarz processed the membership applications. He recorded the dues payments. He kept the accounts. He would continue doing so until the very last weeks of the war, when the organization he had helped build from 54 members to a national governing machine was collapsing around him. His financial records survived him. He didn't survive the war's end by much. In the chaos of 1945, one of the architects of the Nazi Party's administrative structure died in an internment camp near Bad Reichenhall, leaving behind the most complete set of organizational financial records in the party's history. Those records are at the Institute for Zeitgeschichte. They answer some questions, they raise others. Chapter 4. The Diary the Crowds Couldn't Read. Dresden, Germany, the 30th of January 1933, early evening. The city, a few hours behind Munich and Berlin in receiving the news, is learning that Adolf Hitler has been appointed Chancellor of the German Reich. In a house in the Dulchen neighborhood, a man named Victor Klemperer is writing in his diary. He has kept this diary with scholarly consistency. He is, by professional identity, a man who processes the world through written language. Klemperer holds the chair of Romance Philology at Dresden Technical University. He is 51 years old, a veteran of the First World War, a baptized Protestant, and the son of a Jewish rabbi. Under the racial categories that will soon be imposed upon him, he is Jewish. Under his own self-understanding, formed through decades of German education, German military service, German academic life, he is thoroughly and irreducibly German. His diary entry for the 30th of January, 1933, notes the appointment. It does not record panic. It records something more poignant than panic. He writes that he expects Hitler to last, in his estimation, perhaps 6 months. The confidence is not foolishness. It is the faith of a man who has spent his life inside functional German institutions, and who genuinely believes those institutions will correct what he regards as an obvious political aberration. They didn't. And Klemperer's diary, which he kept at enormous personal risk through 12 years of the regime's existence, eventually filling approximately 3,000 handwritten pages, is the most precise contemporaneous record I know of for a specific and consistently underweighted historical question. Not what the regime did, but how fast it happened. The speed of transformation is what Klemperer's diary documents with unintentional precision, because he is recording events in real time, without the retrospective organizing intelligence of memoir. Each entry is time-stamped. The institutional deterioration is not compressed into a narrative arc of escalation. It appears, in the diary, as an accumulation of small, specific events, each one individually manageable, each one collectively catastrophic. His entry for the 13th of February, 1933, 14 days after the appointment, records that a neighbor with whom he had exchanged pleasantries for 11 years passed him on the street without acknowledgement. Klemperer notes with scholarly precision, "He saw me. I am certain of it. He looked away." He does not call this hatred. He calls it a social adjustment. He was already learning the regime's vocabulary before the regime had finished forming itself. The Reichstag fire of the 27th of February, 1933, and the emergency decree of the following day are documented through official German government records, police reports, and contemporaneous newspaper accounts. The decree, signed by President Hindenburg on the 28th of February, formally titled the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of the People and State, suspended Articles 48 through 153 of the Weimar Constitution, effectively abolishing habeas corpus, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and the right to privacy of correspondence. It was presented as a temporary emergency measure. It was never lifted. Klemperer's diary entry from the morning of the 28th records that he understands immediately which of the two events matters more. The building can be rebuilt, he writes. The article cannot. He saw the constitutional mechanics clearly, in real time, before most of the political commentariat had processed what had occurred. That entry, written by an academic in Dresden on a February morning, is in some ways the sharpest piece of political analysis produced anywhere in Germany in that week. The question of who actually set the Reichstag fire is one of those historiographical problems that resists clean resolution despite enormous scholarly attention. The Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene, tried, convicted, and executed. The official Nazi account attributed the fire solely to him as the vanguard of a communist conspiracy. The 1962 West German parliamentary investigation found insufficient evidence to rule out Nazi involvement. Hans Mommsen's structural analysis argued the Nazis were opportunists who exploited an event they didn't plan. Fritz Tobias's detailed reconstruction concluded van der Lubbe acted alone. Both positions have been defended by serious historians using the same documentary record. The fire remains, in the most technically accurate sense, an open historical question, and I find that openness itself is historically significant. A regime that begins with a foundational event of disputed authorship, in which the most likely explanation shifts, depending on which archive you prioritize, has established the epistemological confusion that will characterize it for the next 12 years. The national boycott of Jewish businesses on the 1st of April, 1933, organized by the SA and the NSDAP as a coordinated national action, was not, by the standards of what followed, an extreme event. Shops were picketed, not destroyed. Violence was sporadic, not systematic. It lasted one day before being called off, partly due to international economic pressure from Jewish boycotts of German goods abroad. Klemperer's diary entry for the 1st of April records details that, to me, are more telling than any official report. He notes the SA men stationed outside Jewish shops were young. Boys, really, he writes. He notes that one of the young men was a former student of his from the technical university. The student recognized him. Neither spoke. Klemperer does not editorialize about the encounter. He records it, as he records everything, with the flat precision of a man who has decided that documentation is the only available form of resistance. The student with the armband outside the shop is not, for Klemperer's purposes, a monster. He is a data point. By April of 1933, 67 days after Hitler's appointment, 1,600 Jews had been dismissed from German civil service positions under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. The law contained a specific exemption for Jewish veterans of the First World War, inserted at the insistence of President Hindenburg, who found the dismissal of men who had served Germany in uniform personally distasteful. Klemperer was covered by this exemption. He retained his university position, though under increasing administrative pressure. The exemption protected approximately 12,000 people temporarily, a number that gives you the scale of the regime's cautious pragmatism in its early months. It was dismantling Jewish civic participation systematically, but not yet at maximum speed. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 would make the veterans' exemption irrelevant. Klemperer lost his position in 1935. He was not permitted to use the public library. He was not permitted to own a typewriter. He continued writing by hand. What I find most striking when I read the diary entries from 1933 to 1935 is the texture of how the regime arrived in daily life. Not as a sudden imposition, but as a series of small administrative reclassifications, each individually manageable, each one narrowing the available space by a specific, measurable increment. A new form required, a previously permitted activity now requiring a permit, a professional association that no longer accepts Jewish members, a public swimming pool with a new sign. The regime was not, in these years, operating through the spectacular violence that later characterized it. It was operating through administrative erosion, the slow reclassification of fellow citizens into a different legal category, using the entirely routine machinery of bureaucratic governance. Forms, permits, lists, categories. The horror of the mechanism is its normality. The machinery was not built for this purpose. It was ordinary governance machinery being redirected. Klemperer documented the redirection, form by form, entry by entry. Klemperer's scholarly project during the years of his confinement and humiliation was something he called, privately, LTI, Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich. He was compiling, as a professional linguist, a systematic analysis of how the regime was deforming the German language to make its actions cognitively sustainable. He documented specific transformations. The word fanatisch, fanatical, shifted from a pejorative description to a term of official praise in Nazi usage. The word Aktion, action, replaced pogrom and massacre in official communications. Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, was used in official correspondence to mean murder. Umsiedlung, resettlement, meant forced deportation. The regime understood, at some operational level, that language shapes the limits of what can be imagined, and that if you change the vocabulary of governance, you change what the population is cognitively capable of processing as normal. Klemperer documented each deformation with the methodological discipline of a man who, stripped of every other professional tool, still had his analytical intelligence. He knew, as he wrote, that these notebooks might be the last thing he produced. In February 1945, the Allied firebombing of Dresden destroyed much of the city that Klemperer had spent 30 years inhabiting. He was living, by that point, in a designated Jewish house, one of the overcrowded, surveilled residences to which Dresden's remaining Jewish population had been relocated. He was scheduled for deportation within days. The final transport orders had been issued. In the chaos of the bombing and its aftermath, his wife Eva removed the yellow Star of David armband from his coat. They walked out of the burning city on foot. They assumed false identities. They survived in the German countryside until the American army arrived in May 1945. Victor Klemperer lived. His diaries survived. He had buried portions of them in his garden throughout the war and retrieved them after. He published LTI in 1947. The diaries themselves were published, in full, in 1995, 50 years after the events they describe. They were an immediate sensation. They have not been out of print since. Eva Klemperer's role in their survival receives, in the documentary record, the specific quality of attention that history reserves for women who saved men's lives. It is acknowledged in footnotes and appendices. She was not Jewish under the regime's definitions. She could have left him. She had multiple opportunities to seek protection independently. She chose not to, and her choice, legally and personally costly, is the reason the diaries exist. Victor Klemperer's name is on the covers of the books, as it should be, because he wrote them. But Eva's name is on the reason they are there to be read. The entry in the diary where she removes the armband in the burning city is not dramatic. He records it with the same flat precision he applies to everything else. Eva took it off, he writes. No further commentary. In this small recorded gesture, in a burning city in the last winter of the war, the entire 12-year story of what two people chose to do with the resources available to them is compressed into 4 words. Chapter 5. The Ledger of Guns Before Butter. Berlin, 1934. The Reich Finance Ministry building on Wilhelmstrasse. Deep in its filing rooms, a specific category of document is being created that will not appear in any published budget, any public financial report, or any statement to the Reichstag. The documents are records of a financial instrument called the Mefo Wechsel, the Mefo bill, and their existence is known, at this stage, to approximately 24 people in the German government and banking system. Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, and the most technically accomplished economist in the Nazi government, is the instrument's primary architect. Schacht is not a Nazi by conviction. He is a technocrat by temperament, a man who finds in the management of financial systems an intellectual satisfaction that politics doesn't provide. He has, in 1933 and 34, achieved something genuinely remarkable. Germany's official unemployment rate has dropped from roughly 6 million to something approaching 3 million. Industrial output is rising, and international financial markets, which expected German default, are instead observing what appears to be an economic recovery. What the international markets cannot see, because it is specifically designed to be invisible, is how the recovery is being financed. The Mefo bill is how. The mechanism is worth explaining with some precision, because it becomes structurally significant in ways that extend well beyond the 1930s. The Reich secretly capitalized a shell company, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, the Metallurgical Research Company, or MIFO, with 1 million Reichsmarks. The company performed no metallurgical research. It existed on paper as a financial conduit. Arms contractors, Krupp, Rheinmetall, Daimler-Benz, and others, delivered equipment to the Wehrmacht and received MIFO bills in payment instead of Reichsmarks. These bills were guaranteed by the Reichsbank, so the contractors could discount them at commercial banks and receive actual currency. The bills didn't appear on the state budget. They matured after 5 years. Between 1934 and 1938, 12 billion Reichsmarks of MIFO bills were issued, representing approximately 50% of German military expenditure in that period. The entire rearmament of Germany, in its critical first phase, was conducted off the books of the German state. It was, in the most technically precise financial language available, a sovereign Ponzi scheme. German steel production in 1938 stood at 22.5 million tons annually, compared to Britain's 10.5 million tons. In raw tonnage, Germany was the dominant steel producer in Europe. But the allocation figure is where the story becomes specific. 52% of German steel production in 1938 went directly to arms and military-related manufacturing, compared to Britain's approximately 14%. Germany had more steel and was consuming it more aggressively for military purposes. But the critical accompanying figure, which the finance ministry records make clear, is that there were virtually no strategic reserves, no stockpiles of semi-finished materials, and no buffer against supply disruption. The German economy of the late 1930s was running at what a modern systems analyst would call maximum throughput with minimum redundancy. It was producing at extraordinary rates. It had almost no capacity to absorb shock. The 4-year plan of 1936, announced by Hitler and placed under Göring's administrative authority, is one of those episodes that rewards technical engagement over political narrative. The plan's internal documents, analyzed by Richard Overy, set production targets for synthetic fuel and rubber that German industrial capacity, assessed honestly, could not meet. The gap between planned and actual production appears in the plan's very first quarterly progress report, filed in early 1937. By 1938, synthetic fuel production was running at roughly 42% of the target Göring had set. Synthetic rubber production was at approximately 1/3 of the planned level. These gaps were not secrets within the relevant ministries. They were documented in routine administrative reports. But the organizational logic of the Nazi state, with its Führerprinzip and its culture of managing upward with positive information, meant that the gaps were not being clearly communicated to the levels of leadership where they might have modified the strategic timeline. The plans were aspirational. The reports were diplomatic. The fuel levels were real. Schack's August 1938 memorandum to Reich Finance Minister Schwerin von Krosigk, a document I find myself returning to repeatedly in the archival record, runs to 7 pages of statistical analysis. The first 6 pages are technically dense. Production figures, deficit projections, reserve assessments, exchange rate vulnerabilities. The 7th page contains a single sentence that Schack underlined 3 times in red ink, according to the document as preserved in the Bundesarchiv. The sentence states, in translation, that the present rate of rearmament expenditure cannot be sustained beyond approximately 18 months without either the conquest of additional resources or national bankruptcy. This is Schack's professional assessment. He knows the numbers better than anyone in the German government. He is telling the finance minister, in writing, in the clearest language available, that the economic model requires war, not because Hitler has decided to go to war, but because the financial structure already constructed cannot function without territorial expansion. The memo was filed in August. Schack was dismissed from the economics ministry in November. He retained the Reichsbank presidency until January 1939, when he was dismissed from that position as well. When I cross-referenced Schack's assessment with the actual reserve figures at the outbreak of war in September 1939, the numbers are stark. When Germany invaded Poland, the Reichsbank's gold and foreign currency reserves stood at approximately 500 million Reichsmarks, enough to finance, by the finance ministry's own wartime calculation models, approximately 3 weeks of full-scale military operations. 3 weeks. the most powerful military force in continental Europe, launched what it intended as a multi-year campaign, with enough liquid reserves for 21 days. The country did not go to war from a position of financial strength. It went to war because the financial structure that had been constructed could not be sustained in peace. Adam Tooze's analysis in The Wages of Destruction makes this case with archival precision, and it remains, to me, one of the most important reframings of the standard narrative about Nazi Germany's apparent economic confidence in 1939. There is a historiographical disagreement here that I should put on the table directly, because it matters for how you understand the war's causes. Richard Overy, in War and Economy in the Third Reich, published in 1994, argues that Germany was not fully mobilized for war in 1939, that Hitler intended to reach full war economy mobilization only by approximately 1943 to 1945, and that the early campaigns were designed to be fast, limited, and financially self-funding through captured resources. Adam Tooze's reading of the same German archival data leads him to a different conclusion, that Germany was already at the practical limits of its economic mobilization by 1938 to 1939, and that the timing of aggression was determined not by Hitler's preferred strategic schedule, but by the impossibility of maintaining the existing financial structure in peacetime for much longer. Both historians are serious scholars using German archival data. Their conclusions about the relationship between economic necessity and the outbreak of war are genuinely incompatible. I find Tooze's reading more persuasive, particularly given Schacht's memo, but this is an active debate, not a settled question, and the reader should know that. What the guns before butter slogan, used in Nazi propaganda from the mid-1930s, actually meant in practice was something more specific than a simple prioritization of military spending over consumer goods. It meant a systematic suppression of civilian consumption through price controls, rationing of imported goods, and the redirection of industrial capacity away from consumer manufacturing and toward armaments. A German household's access to cooking fat, cotton cloth, and certain food categories was measurably declining from roughly 1935 onward. The regime tracked public morale reports, the SD Berichte of the Security Service, and these internal assessments, preserved at the Bundesarchiv, document consistent popular complaint about consumer shortages throughout the late 1930s. The German population was not universally enthusiastic about the sacrifice they were being asked to make for the regime's strategic agenda. They were, however, not in a position to express that lack of enthusiasm through any normal democratic channel. The trade-off between guns and butter was not a choice the population was permitted to vote on. Hjalmar Schacht was tried at Nuremberg and acquitted. The tribunal concluded his economic activities, however central to German rearmament, did not meet the legal threshold for the crimes charged. He was rearrested by German denazification authorities and subsequently released after a further tribunal. He then worked for approximately 2 decades as an international financial consultant, advising on central banking development in post-colonial nations in Africa and Asia. The man who built the shell company architecture of Nazi rearmament and the off-balance sheet financing that made the Wehrmacht possible spent his post-war career helping developing nations construct sound monetary systems. He was interviewed extensively, wrote his memoirs, was treated as an elder statesman of international finance, and died in Munich in 1970 at the age of 93, with his reputation as an economist substantially intact. The MIFO bill mechanism, the specific financial instrument he designed in 1934, is now documented as a case study in illicit sovereign debt concealment in financial criminology curricula at several European business schools. The mechanism is taught. The man who designed it is, in most of those curricula, a footnote. The German economy of 1939 was, in a specific and technically precise sense, a theater set, a facade of industrial power and financial confidence constructed over a structural void. The void was the unpayable debt, the exhausted reserves, the production gaps, the suppressed consumption. The facade was the autobahns, the rallies, the unemployment figures, the steel tonnage. Schacht had known this. He had documented it in red ink. He had been dismissed. And on the 1st of September, 1939, the machine whose financing he had described as structurally impossible went to war, because war, by then, was the only remaining financial option. Chapter 6. 36 hours in June. The 30th of June, 1934, 06:47 in the morning, according to the SS operational log, partially preserved in captured German documents at the National Archives in Washington. A man named Ernst Röhm, head of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, Hitler's original paramilitary force, a veteran of the First World War, holder of a wound badge and several decorations, the commander of what is by this point a 2.9 million strong organization, is being transported to cell 474 at Stadelheim prison in Munich. The log entry is routine in its formatting: time, subject, location, destination. The next entry referencing cell 474 is time-stamped at 14:30 hours. 7.5 hours separate the two entries. The log is silent in between, not damaged, not redacted, simply unwritten. The 7.5 hour gap is the space in which a head of government organized the murder of one of his oldest political associates and decided that no written record of the specific decision was appropriate. The log's silence is the document. The night of the long knives, the 36-hour period between the late evening of the 29th of June and the early hours of the 2nd of July, 1934, is the episode in which the Nazi regime demonstrated, with operational clarity, that it could murder German citizens without judicial process, and that the German establishment would not only fail to resist this, but would legally ratify it within 3 days. The target was the SA leadership, the body of men who had been the movement's street muscle through the years of struggle, and whose continued existence now represented, for the Wehrmacht officer corps and for the conservative establishment, an uncomfortable ambiguity about who held real power in the new Germany. Röhm had made no secret of his ambition to merge the SA with the regular army under his own command, an ambition that the Wehrmacht's professional officer corps found, in the most professional possible terms, entirely unacceptable. The army wanted the SA neutralized. Hitler needed the army's loyalty. The calculation was simple, which doesn't make what followed any less deliberate. The operational planning for what became the Purge was conducted through the SS under Himmler and Heydrich, drawing on intelligence assessments, some of which were fabricated or heavily embellished, that characterized the SA leadership as planning an imminent coup. The charge was not supported by genuine evidence, and the internal SS assessments that have survived in archival form are not internally consistent in their claims. What they provided was a paper rationale, not a factual one. Hitler flew personally to Bad Wiessee on the Tegernsee south of Munich, where Röhm and the SA leadership were vacationing, arriving in the early morning hours of the 30th. His personal adjutant Wilhelm Bruckner's diary describes Hitler's demeanor on entering the hotel as theatrical rage. And then, in what appears to be a moment of self-editorial correction visible in the manuscript, Bruckner crosses out that characterization and replaces it with righteous fury. The crossing out matters. It suggests Bruckner recognized the performance as a performance, understood that recording it as such was dangerous, and corrected himself accordingly. The emendation is the human signature of a man already practicing the regime's relationship with documented truth. The murder of former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher on the 30th of June presents a specific evidentiary problem that the historical record has never fully resolved. Schleicher was a conservative army general, former head of government, one of the establishment figures who had negotiated Hitler's appointment as chancellor. A man, in other words, of impeccable nationalist credentials and no personal connection to the SA. He was shot in his home office. His wife, who was present, was also shot. She had not been on any operational list. The SS unit that killed them acted, by the surviving internal SS correspondence, outside the specific parameters of their operational orders. When the overstep was reported upward through the chain of command, the response, documented in a surviving SS memo, was recorded as action noted, no further inquiry. No individual was disciplined. No operational review was conducted. The response to an extrajudicial killing that exceeded its own extrajudicial authorization was administrative filing. This is the regime's moral architecture in miniature. Violence that goes beyond the plan is absorbed into the plan, retroactively, by the simple act of not questioning it. The total death toll of the Purge is, in the strictest historiographical sense, uncertain, and I think it's important to hold that uncertainty clearly, rather than settling on a convenient single number. The Nazi government officially acknowledged 77 deaths. A 1934 internal inquiry estimated between 150 and 200. Ian Kershaw's careful reconstruction in Hitler, Hubris, arrives at approximately 85. Some historians believe the figure, when accounting for associated killings in the weeks following the main event, may be closer to 400. The regime destroyed most operational records. What survived are fragments, the operational log with its 7.5-hour silence, pieces of internal SS correspondence, post-war testimony gathered under conditions of varying reliability. The specific number we cannot know is itself a document of the regime's approach to accountability. 3 days after the killings, on the 3rd of July 1934, the Reich cabinet passed a single-paragraph law declaring all actions taken on the 30th of June, 1st and 2nd of July to be emergency state defense measures, and therefore legal. It was drafted by Reich Justice Minister Franz Gertner in approximately 2 hours. Carl Schmitt, the most distinguished constitutional legal theorist in Germany, a man of genuine intellectual accomplishment, whose academic work on constitutional emergency powers was internationally respected, published an article in the Deutsche Juristenzeitung endorsing the law. Under the title, "The Führer Protects the Law." The article's argument is technically sophisticated and morally annihilating. Schmitt argues that in a genuine emergency, the sovereign's action is by definition the law, and that therefore the Führer's determination that the killings were necessary is itself the legal authorization for them. This is not propaganda by a hack. It is a serious legal argument by a serious legal mind. That is what makes it so specifically disturbing to read. Schmitt was using his professional expertise to construct the legal architecture of impunity, and he was doing it well. To me, the Schmitt article is in some ways more troubling than the killings themselves, not because it is worse, but because it represents a different category of moral failure. The SS men who carried out the executions were operating in a context of direct command authority and organizational culture. Schmitt was operating from a law faculty desk, with the full freedom of his professional judgment available to him. He chose to use that judgment in the service of legal legitimization for murder. That specific choice, the voluntary application of intellectual expertise to the laundering of state violence, is what I think about when the discussion of the Third Reich asks how it was possible. It was possible because Schmitt existed, because there were enough people with enough expertise who made enough choices like his, in enough professional domains, to give the regime's violence a texture of institutional normality. The Wehrmacht's personal loyalty oath, administered across the entire German military on the 2nd of August 1934, following the death of Hindenburg, who died that morning, represents the Long Knives' most consequential institutional aftermath. The oath that every German soldier swore from that day forward was specifically constructed. It was sworn not to the Constitution, not to the state, not to the German people, but to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people. The legal significance of this formulation was immediately apparent to military lawyers. It nullified the traditional officer's duty to disobey illegal orders. Under the Weimar military tradition, an officer's primary obligation was to the constitutional order. An illegal order could therefore be refused on constitutional grounds. Under the new oath, refusal of any order was not merely military insubordination. It was a violation of a personally sworn sacred obligation. Approximately 750,000 men swore this oath on the 2nd of August, 1934. They did not, in most cases, understand what they were giving up. The men who designed the oath understood exactly what they were taking. The Stadelheim prison, where Rome was held in cell 474 on the 30th of June, still stands in Munich as a working correctional facility. The cell block from 1934 is no longer in active use. Rome's cell is not marked. Schleicher's house in the Berlin suburb of Neubabelsberg was eventually demolished. The site is now residential. The railway car in which Hitler signed the retroactive legalization memo, a detail I've been unable to confirm to archival specificity, so I won't claim the specific vehicle, has no memorial function. The operational log, with its 7.5-hour silence, is in a box at the National Archives in Washington, in the captured documents collection, in the way that many of the regime's most revealing records ended up, preserved by the enemies of the state that created them, because those enemies understood that the paperwork was as important as the rubble. Carl Schmitt was arrested by the SS in 1936 on charges related to insufficient ideological reliability. The details of the internal SS politics that produced the arrest are complex and have never been fully reconstructed. He was released, stripped of most official positions, and spent the remainder of the war writing privately. He was not prosecuted at Nuremberg. He was interned briefly in 1945, questioned by American interrogators, and released. He lived until 1985, dying at 96 in his hometown of Plettenberg in Westphalia. He continued to write on constitutional law and political theory until the end of his life. His theoretical work, particularly his concept of the state of exception, the idea that sovereign power is defined by the capacity to suspend normal legal order in an emergency, was rediscovered by legal scholars in the United States and Europe in the years after the attacks of the 11th of September, 2001, when debates about executive detention authority, enhanced interrogation, and emergency security legislation made his arguments newly relevant. He is cited by name in legal briefs and academic papers produced in several Western democracies in the last decade. The jurisprudence of the Night of the Long Knives is not a historical artifact. It is a living intellectual inheritance, and what is done with it remains, in 2026, an open question. Chapter 7. The Nuremberg Geometry. Nuremberg, September 1934. The sun is going down behind the Zeppelinfeld Stadium, and the light is doing something that no one who was present that evening seems to have been able to describe adequately. 130 military-grade searchlights, Flakscheinwerfer 34 anti-aircraft units, each producing a beam approximately 1 meter in diameter at ground level, are angled vertically into the darkening sky, positioned in a precise circle around the rally field. The beams expand as they climb, each one reaching perhaps 25 meters in diameter at 8,000 meters altitude. And together they form a dome of white light, visible from roughly 100 kilometers in every direction. Albert Speer, who designed the installation, later wrote that the British ambassador Sir Neville Henderson called it both overwhelming and deeply sinister. And then, in the Foreign Office dispatch copy preserved at Kew, Henderson had crossed out deeply sinister and replaced it with extraordinarily effective. Both versions of the phrase are visible in the manuscript. Henderson understood what he was looking at. He chose, for diplomatic purposes, to describe it differently. That crossed-out phrase is, to me, one of the most honest documents produced by any foreign observer of the Nazi regime in its middle years. Speer's architectural archive, portions of which are held at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, and portions at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, contains a set of engineering drawings for the Zeppelinfeld's lighting system, dated 1936. The drawings are technically precise. Searchlight positioning, beam angles, electrical load calculations, generator placement. They are the working documents of a professional architect solving a specific technical problem. But alongside the technical specifications, in Speer's own handwriting, there is a note that shifts the document's register entirely. The note, translated, reads approximately, "The columns must be close enough that the crowd cannot perceive the darkness between them." This is not an aesthetic instruction. It is a psychological one. Speer is not describing how the lights should look. He is describing what the crowd must be prevented from seeing. The darkness between the columns is the available alternative, the space where individual judgment might reassert itself, where the gap between one blazing certainty and the next might admit a doubt. The engineering specification is for the elimination of that gap. The Cathedral of Light was, in its most precise functional description, a machine for the removal of cognitive alternatives. The Nuremberg rally grounds were planned at a scale that requires some effort to hold in the imagination. The full architectural program, documented in Speer's office correspondence from 1937 through 1942, called for a domed Congress hall seating 50,000, a parade ground accommodating 1 million people, a stadium designed to exceed the Olympic dimensions, and a great road, the Grosse Strasse, 2.5 kilometers long and 60 meters wide, lined in granite. The planned domed hall would have stood 290 meters high, 16 meters taller than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, with an interior volume so vast that Speer noted in his calculations that condensation from the breath of the assembled crowd would likely produce clouds inside the building at certain atmospheric conditions. He recorded this as a logistical consideration, not as a warning. The scale was not incidental to the ideology. It was the ideology, expressed in concrete and stone. The granite for the Zeppelinfeld and the associated construction program was quarried from a site in Bavaria near the town of Floss, where the concentration camp Flossenburg was established in May 1938, specifically to provide the labor force for stone extraction. The establishment date is documented in the camp's founding administrative records. The Nuremberg building program and the concentration camp system were not separate administrative projects that happened to run concurrently. They shared a material supply chain. The stone underfoot in the Zeppelinfeld came from a quarry worked by concentration camp prisoners. This fact appears in no contemporary architectural publication, no official program for the rallies, no public documentation of any kind. It appears in the internal procurement records. The administrative connection between the grandeur of the surface and the human cost of producing it was bureaucratically present and publicly invisible. The 1934 Nuremberg Rally was the occasion for Leni Riefenstahl's documentary film Triumph of the Will, which deserves to be discussed as what it actually was, rather than what it presented itself as being. Documents in the Riefenstahl archive at the Stiftung Deutsche Kinemathek in Berlin show that the physical arrangements of certain rally formations were modified at Riefenstahl's direction during the event itself. Units repositioned for camera angle, sequences reorganized for narrative clarity. Hitler, Riefenstahl, and Speer had coordinated the physical design of the rally in advance with the film's visual requirements in mind. The documentary of the event was not a record of something that occurred independently of the documentary. It was partially constitutive of the event itself. The rally was designed to be filmed, and the film was designed to look like an unmediated record of spontaneous mass devotion. The circularity of this, a manufactured event documented as authentic, and the document itself presented as evidence of the authentic emotion that produced the event, is the specific propaganda technology that Triumph of the Will represents. It was extraordinarily effective. Every subsequent political documentary has lived in its shadow. When I look at the contrast between the aesthetic achievement of the Nuremberg lighting design and what was happening simultaneously in the supply chain that funded it, I find myself thinking about the specific professional discipline that enables a person to solve one problem with complete technical focus, while maintaining what appears to be genuine cognitive separation from an adjacent problem. Speer's design notes for the lighting system are those of an engaged, creative professional. His procurement paperwork authorizing the Flossenburg granite supply chain is those of an efficient administrator. The two documents don't speak to each other. That silence, the professional compartmentalization between the aesthetics and the supply chain, is not unique to Speer, and that's precisely what makes it significant. Speer's post-war memoir, Inside the Third Reich, published in 1970, presents his architectural work as the activity of an artist in service of a patron, a man absorbed by aesthetic problems who was not paying adequate attention to political and moral ones. The internal planning documents tell a different story. Historian Lars Olof Larsson's analysis of the Nuremberg Rally Planning Archive found Speer submitting explicit psychological effect assessments alongside the technical drawings, documents that discuss how specific visual proportions would produce feelings of individual smallness and collective magnitude in the assembled crowd. An artist serving a patron describes what a building will look like. A propagandist engineering a psychological outcome describes what a crowd will feel. Speer's rally documents are in the second category. His post-war memoir insists they were in the first. The documents in the memoir cannot both be accurate about the same professional intentions. The contre-jour lighting principle that Speer applied in the Cathedral of Light had a specific technical lineage in theatrical design. It's the principle of lighting a subject from behind, to strip individual features and merge distinct figures into a unified visual mass. When you light a crowd from below and behind, you eliminate faces. You eliminate individuality. What you see from within the crowd and from any documenting camera is a collective silhouette, a single organism rather than an assembly of separate people. The searchlights at Nuremberg were achieving, through exterior illumination, something analogous to what the lighting designers of the Wagnerian opera tradition had been pursuing for decades in interior theatrical spaces: the dissolution of individual identity into a collective emotional state. The specific weaponization of this technique at a political rally, at the scale of hundreds of thousands of people, was Speer's contribution to the technology of mass politics. The artist David Hockney, in a 1985 interview, described it as the greatest theatrical lighting design of the 20th century. He later said he regretted the compliment because it was entirely accurate, and accuracy felt, in that context, like an uncomfortable thing to offer. The planned Germania rebuilding of Berlin, Hitler's vision for the capital of a continental empire, is documented in Speer's office correspondence from the late 1930s. The plans were not idle fantasy. Detailed architectural drawings were produced, land surveys conducted, and preliminary demolition of existing Berlin structures begun. The scale was not symbolic, it was operational. The planned Central Avenue, the Prachtstrasse, was to be 7 kilometers long and 120 meters wide, roughly twice the width of the Champs-Élysées, lined with government buildings, party headquarters, and foreign embassy compounds designed to communicate, through sheer dimensional authority, the permanent dominance of the regime that had built them. Speer later claimed the Germania plans were his greatest architectural work and his deepest professional regret. He did not always explain clearly which emotion applied to which aspect of the project. Speer was sentenced at Nuremberg to 20 years, the only senior convicted Nazi who avoided either the death penalty or life imprisonment. He served the full sentence, was released from Spandau prison in 1966, and spent the next 15 years giving interviews, writing, and carefully constructing the public persona of the decent Nazi, the man who served the regime in a professional capacity without knowing about or participating in its crimes. Documents discovered and analyzed after his death, including correspondence with camp authorities about the provision of slave labor for his armaments projects, suggested that his claimed ignorance was not genuine, but constructed with the same professional precision he had applied to everything else in his career. He had, in effect, designed his own historical reputation as carefully as he had designed the searchlight positions at Nuremberg, specifying what must be visible and what the audience must not be permitted to perceive in the darkness between the columns. He died in London in 1981, at the age of 76, during a visit for a BBC interview. Chapter 8. Crystal Night. Peter Trail, Munich, the 9th of November, 1938, 0120 hours. In his office, Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the security police, SS Obergruppenführer, one of the 2 or 3 most operationally powerful men in the Nazi security apparatus, is composing a telex. The document, captured after the war and held at the National Archives in Washington in Record Group 238, begins with a sentence that is, in its bureaucratic precision, one of the most revealing in the entire documentary record of the regime. Following actions are not to be interfered with. What follows are 3 numbered paragraphs specifying the categories of violence that police should observe without intervention: Jewish businesses, synagogues, Jewish community institutions. A 4th paragraph lists what must be prevented: the looting of non-Jewish German property, violence against foreign nationals. The document is 4 pages. It is time-stamped. It is initialed. It was transmitted through official channels to SS and Gestapo commanders across the Reich. It is the legal structure of a pogrom, formatted as routine operational guidance. The pretext for the night's events had been provided 12 days earlier, when a 17-year-old German Jewish refugee named Herschel Grinspan walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot a diplomat named Ernst vom Rath. Grinspan's family had been among thousands of Polish-born Jews summarily deported from Germany to the Polish border in late October, dumped, in many cases, in border towns that refused to accept them, in wretched conditions, without adequate preparation or resources. Vom Rath died on the 9th of November. Joseph Goebbels, at an NSDAP gathering in Munich marking the anniversary of the 1923 putsch, gave a speech that the evening's witnesses described as incendiary. His diary entry for that evening records that Hitler agrees the SA should be allowed to have its fling, a phrase carefully chosen for its ambiguity. It acknowledges a decision. It avoids specifying what the decision was. Goebbels understood, as a professional communicator, the precise value of the phrase that implies, without stating. What happened between the evening of the 9th and the morning of the 10th of November, 1938, is documented from multiple directions, and the documents don't entirely agree with each other, which is itself informative. Between 7,500 and 8,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. 267 synagogues were burned, 91 of them completely. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested in the days following and transported to the concentration camps at Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Contemporary German government sources reported 91 Jews killed outright. Subsequent historical research has consistently suggested the actual death toll was significantly higher. Goebbels' diary suggests the trigger was decided in hours, on the evening of the 9th. But SA operational records and the testimony of SA commanders collected in post-war investigations suggest that logistical preparation, lists of Jewish businesses, pre-positioned units, organizational communication, predated the vom Roth assassination by weeks. These two accounts cannot be simultaneously accurate. Either the pogrom was improvised in an evening, or it was organized in advance, and the vom Roth assassination provided the occasion rather than the cause. The evidence points toward the second interpretation, but Goebbels' diary, the most detailed contemporaneous source, was written by the man most interested in establishing the first. The broken glass that gave the night its sardonic popular name, Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, weighed, by the estimates of propaganda officials who subsequently complained about the economic cost, approximately 800 tons. All of it was imported glass. Germany's foreign currency reserves were severely constrained throughout the late 1930s, and imported goods represented a specific financial liability. This complaint, documented in the November 12 conference record, where senior officials discussed the pogrom's economic consequences with the vocabulary of insurance adjusters, is one of the more extraordinary moments in the documentary record of the Third Reich. The regime's primary official concern about the destruction of 800 tons of glass in Jewish shop windows was the foreign exchange cost of the replacement glass. The human cost, the destroyed livelihoods, the terror visited on an entire civilian population, these appear in the conference record as administrative categories to be managed, not as harms to be acknowledged. The November 12th conference convened by Goering, attended by representatives of the finance ministry, the insurance industry, the economics ministry, and the propaganda ministry, produced a set of minutes that are, in their way, as revealing as the Wannsee Protocol that would follow 3 years later. The assembled officials decided, with the administrative efficiency of men solving a logistics problem, that the 1 billion Reichsmark atonement fine to be levied on the German Jewish community would be deducted directly from insurance payments before the funds reached the claimants. Jewish business owners whose shops had been destroyed by the Nazi state would file insurance claims. The insurance companies would process those claims, and the resulting payments would be intercepted by the state before delivery. The mechanism was legally tidy. It required the cooperation of the German insurance industry, which provided it. It also required meticulous record-keeping of which claims had been filed, in what amounts, and what had been deducted. Those records were kept. They were so well kept that they became, in the 1990s and 2000s, the primary documentary basis for Holocaust-era insurance restitution litigation against European insurance companies. The administrative precision of the confiscation created the paper trail that enabled partial recovery 60 years later. The Aryanization of Jewish businesses, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned enterprises to non-Jewish German buyers at state-mandated prices, had been proceeding through legal mechanisms since the April 1938 Registration of Jewish Assets Decree, which required all Jews to register holdings above 5,000 Reichsmarks. This created a precise inventory of Jewish wealth held by the finance ministry: names, addresses, asset categories, valuations. After the November pogrom, the Aryanization process accelerated dramatically. A December decree prohibited Jews from operating retail businesses. A forced sale mechanism established prices for transferred assets at typically 10 to 20% of assessed value. The transaction sequence was bureaucratically clean: official valuation, compulsory offer, mandatory acceptance, state fee deducted, net transfer registered. This is how property is transferred in a functioning administrative state. The machinery was not invented for this purpose. It was borrowed from ordinary commercial law and redirected. The horror lies precisely in the routine competence with which it operated. When I was working through the insurance records alongside the November 12th conference minutes, I found it striking how much the documentary record of Kristallnacht is a record of financial transactions rather than violence. The violence is documented in police reports and SD assessments, but the paper trail that is richest, most complete, and most carefully maintained is the property transfer record. The valuations, the claims, the deductions, the transfer registers. The regime processed a pogrom the way a competent accounts department processes a restructuring. categorize the assets, establish the transfer mechanism, document the transaction, file the record. The administrative precision is not incidental to the moral catastrophe. It is part of the moral catastrophe's specific character. The international response to the November pogrom was documented across diplomatic cables from the American, British, and French embassies in Berlin. The American ambassador Hugh Wilson was recalled for consultations, the strongest diplomatic response the Roosevelt administration made. He was never sent back. Britain issued diplomatic protests. France issued diplomatic protests. The League of Nations issued a statement. Within approximately 3 weeks, normal diplomatic relations had substantially resumed across all 3 channels. The regime had conducted an open, organized, citywide pogrom against a civilian population in broad daylight, with photographic evidence widely available, with foreign diplomatic observers present in German cities throughout. And the practical international consequence was a temporary diplomatic chill. This is not a retrospective judgment applied with the clarity of hindsight. The consequence was visible in real time. German officials noted it. The lesson they drew from it is documented in subsequent internal communications, that the international community would protest and not act, and that this asymmetry between rhetoric and response could be treated as operational clearance. The morning of the 11th of November brought German city streets full of broken glass, smoldering ruins, and the absence, sudden and total, of approximately 30,000 men who had been taken in the night. Klemperer's diary entry for the 10th of November, which he wrote with his characteristic refusal of rhetoric, records the smoke visible from a synagogue burning several streets from his house. He notes the absence of fire brigade response. He notes the sound of broken glass being swept. He notes that a neighbor comments, without evident distress, that it was a bit much. That phrase, recorded without comment in the diary of a man whose community has just been subjected to a coordinated night of organized destruction, is, to me, the precise measure of how far normalization had progressed in 5 years. Not approval, not enthusiasm, not horror, just a bit much. The calibration of acceptable violence had been adjusted, incrementally, in 5 years of small administrative reclassifications, to a point where a coordinated national pogrom registered, for a substantial portion of the civilian population, somewhere in the register of excess rather than atrocity. The November pogrom is now commemorated annually in Germany and across much of Europe on the 9th of November as a day of remembrance. The date carries additional historical weight in Germany. The proclamation of the Weimar Republic in 1918, the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 all occurred on the 9th of November. The concentration of historical inflection points on a single calendar date has given German public life a specific and complicated relationship with that date. A single day that contains, within the span of 71 years, a democratic birth, a fascist failure, a democratic catastrophe, and a democratic recovery. The insurance records from the November 12th conference are in the Bundesarchiv. The meticulous transaction documentation of a system that processed dispossession is publicly accessible, cross-referenced, and available to researchers. The paper trail survived everything. It always does. Chapter 9. The Blitzkrieg Memo Nobody Read. The 16th of May, 1940. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, in the headquarters of the 19th Panzer Corps, there is a fuel status report being compiled. The document, a routine quartermaster assessment, the kind produced daily in any functioning military organization, contains a figure that would, if acted upon with appropriate urgency, have changed the outcome of the campaign in France. Heinz Guderian's leading tank formations are operating at 30% fuel capacity. The resupply convoys are approximately 80 kilometers behind the armored spearhead, stuck in a traffic jam in the Ardennes road network that no one had adequately planned for, because the operational plan had insisted the roads were adequate, and the logistics branch had been overruled when it suggested otherwise. The officer who prepared the fuel report added a note in pencil in the margin. Befehl unmöglich. Order impossible. He was describing the follow-up advance order that had just arrived from OKW, the Supreme Command. He wrote it in pencil, in the margin, as if uncertain whether it was the kind of thing a junior staff officer should commit to official record. The advance was executed anyway. It worked. But the margin note tells you something about the campaign's true character that the victory communiques do not. The fall of France in June 1940 is, in almost every popular account, presented as the product of German military superiority. Faster, better organized, more innovative, tactically overwhelming. The operational record suggests something more uncomfortable. A bold plan that worked because a series of improbable things went right simultaneously, and that was, at several specific documented moments, approximately one logistical failure away from stalling in the Ardennes and giving the French time to reorganize their response. The plan itself, the Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut through the Ardennes that Erich von Manstein had argued for, and OKH had initially rejected as operationally unreasonable, was approved with 7 armored divisions traversing a road network that the Wehrmacht's own logistics branch had assessed as unsuitable for more than 3. The French General Staff, reviewing the same assessment, had reached the same conclusion and left the Ardennes sector lightly defended. Germany gambled on a logistical impossibility. France bet that Germany would not. Both parties were working from the same engineering data. Only one of them was wrong. The German Army Group A War Diary for May 10 through 25, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg under reference RH19I/38, is a remarkable document, not because it records a smooth operational execution, but because it records, with the flat honesty of routine military record-keeping, the accumulating evidence of an advance that was barely staying ahead of its own collapse. Fuel shortages, bridge capacity crises, traffic accidents, unit formations hopelessly mixed in the single-lane Ardennes roads, supply columns arriving hours or days behind schedule. The advance worked because the French command and control system, operating through a slower and more hierarchical decision cycle, could not exploit the German operational problems in the time available before German units moved on. The German War Diary reads, in its most honest passages, like a record of a controlled stumble, a fall forward that happened to land on a victory. The halt order at Dunkirk, issued on the 24th of May, 1940, stopping the German armored advance on the coastal perimeter where the British Expeditionary Force and significant French forces had been driven, has been analyzed in more detail than almost any tactical decision of the Western campaign. The standard account attributes it to Hitler, explains it as a political decision to spare Britain as a potential future partner, and presents it as the essential gift that allowed the Dunkirk evacuation. The Army Group A War Diary complicates this. By the 23rd and 24th of May, Gerd von Rundstedt's staff had already been noting, in operational assessments, that the armored formations were severely overextended and that a consolidation pause was desirable on military grounds before the final advance. Guderian's own Corps Diary records maintenance states that, at this point in the campaign, had more than a third of its tanks non-operational for mechanical reasons. The halt order reflected at minimum a convergence of Hitler's political preference and the Army's genuine operational exhaustion. Guderian's later memoir attributes the halt entirely to Hitler's political interference. The contemporary War Diary doesn't support that clean attribution. These two sources, memoir and operational log, written by or about the same events, tell incompatible stories. The panzer formations that drove through France were equipped primarily with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, whose mechanical reliability under continuous operational conditions ran at approximately 60 to 65%, according to OKH maintenance assessments. On any given day of the campaign, between 1/3 and 40% of the armored force was non-operational for mechanical reasons. Not combat damage, but engineering failure. The significance of this figure is not that the German tanks were unreliable. All tanks of this period suffered comparable maintenance rates under sustained operations. The significance is that the Germans had built a combined arms system that could sustain offensive momentum even with 1/3 of its armor unavailable, because the coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and close air support, and critically, the radio architecture that enabled real-time communication between those arms, allowed them to exploit tactical breakthroughs faster than French command structures could respond. France had comparable numbers of tanks. Several French tank models were technically superior to the Panzer III. France did not have the FM radio architecture in its armored units that would have allowed those tanks to function as a coordinated mobile system, rather than as individual or small group assets. Germany's decisive advantage in the 1940 campaign was not metallurgical, it was electromagnetic. The entire German armored advance through France and the Low Countries, from the 10th of May to the 25th of June, consumed approximately 1.36 million tons of fuel, according to Wehrmacht quartermaster records. At the moment of the French armistice, on the 22nd of June, German fuel reserves forward of the Rhine stood at approximately 86,000 tons, roughly 6 days of operational consumption at campaign rates. 6 days. The conquest of France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, the military campaign that altered the strategic map of Europe more dramatically than any operation since Napoleon, concluded with Germany's forward fuel reserves at 6 days of supply. The margin between France fell and Germany ran out of fuel in the middle of France was, by the quartermaster's arithmetic, approximately 1 week. History doesn't feel contingent when you're reading the outcome. It feels contingent when you're reading the fuel logs. The armistice ceremony of the 22nd of June 1940 took place at Compiègne, in the forest of Compiègne, approximately 80 kilometers northeast of Paris. Hitler had the precise location chosen deliberately. It was the site of the November 1918 armistice that had ended the First World War. The specific railway carriage, Wagenlitz Company Car number 2419D, in which the German delegation had signed the 1918 armistice, had been preserved in a museum at Compiègne. Hitler ordered it transported to the original clearing. He sat in the same chair, the chair in which the German delegation had sat in November 1918 to receive Allied terms. He received the French delegation. He then had the carriage removed to Germany. The gesture was extensively photographed. The newsreel footage was distributed globally. Hitler's adjutant's account of the ceremony records the deliberateness of every physical detail, the chair, the location, the choreography of entry and seating, as the product of explicit prior planning. This was not improvised theater. It was scripted theater, performed for a global audience, communicating the specific reversal of 1918 with a physical precision that no speech could have achieved. The carriage did not survive the war. It was taken to Berlin for display, then moved to storage in Krauwinkel in Thuringia as Allied bombing intensified. It was destroyed by fire during an Allied air raid in 1945. Hitler's dramatic act of historical erasure, the physical destruction of the object that embodied German humiliation, was itself undone by the war that his regime had initiated. The carriage outlasted the gesture and was destroyed by its consequences. The clearing at Compiègne is still there. The French maintain it as a memorial site. A replica carriage is displayed in the museum. The original chair in which Hitler sat to receive the French delegation, the same chair in which Germans had received Allied terms in 1918, is, in a small irony of archival survival, preserved in France. I find myself returning to the fuel logs more than to any other documentation of the 1940 campaign, because they resist the narrative of inevitability more effectively than any other source type. Battles produce winners and losers, and winners' victories tend, in retrospect, to acquire an air of predetermined outcome. The quartermaster's documents don't permit that reading. They record, with professional dispassion, the gap between what was required and what was available. And they make clear that the gap, on multiple occasions, was narrower than the victory communiques implied. The May 16th margin note, Befehl unmöglich, was written by a staff officer who didn't know he was participating in a famous victory. He thought he was noting an operational impossibility. The impossibility was executed. It worked. The margin note remained. It is the most honest document the campaign produced. Chapter 10. Operation Barbarossa and the Edge of the Known World. The 22nd of June, 1941, 4:15 in the morning. Along a frontier stretching approximately 2,900 kilometers, from the Baltic coast in the north to the Carpathian foothills in the south, 3.8 million Axis troops begin crossing into the Soviet Union. The noise, by the accounts of soldiers on both sides of the line, is beyond any experiential reference point. Not one sound but a physical environment of sound, encompassing everything. The German operational plan, codenamed Barbarossa, projects the campaign will be concluded in 8 to 12 weeks. The Wehrmacht's own pre-operational fuel assessment, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, projects that German supply capacity will be insufficient to sustain offensive operations beyond approximately 700 kilometers from the start line. Moscow is approximately 1,000 kilometers from the Polish border. Someone had noted this discrepancy in the planning process. The operation proceeded on the assumption that the campaign would be decided before the supply line failed. It was an assumption without logistical foundation, dressed as strategic confidence. The Kommissarbefehl, the Commissar Order, had been distributed to German field commanders on the 6th of June, 1941, 12 days before the first soldier crossed the Soviet border. The order's text, 12 paragraphs long, directed that captured Soviet political commissars attached to Red Army units were not to be treated as prisoners of war, but were to be liquidated, at the latest in the transit camps behind the front lines. The distribution log preserved at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv records 42 signatures of acknowledgement from corps and division commanders. These were professional military officers, men who had served under legal military codes that define the treatment of prisoners of war with relative clarity, and they signed a document that directed the murder of captured enemy personnel before a single shot had been fired in the campaign. Some disobeyed the order in practice, most did not. The distinction is documented, and it is important. Colonel Hans von Herwarth later recorded that his unit declined to execute the order, which establishes the compliance as a choice rather than a compulsion. 42 signatures. Some men refused. The ones who refused are mentioned in the footnotes of the standard accounts. The specific metallurgical problem that would help destroy the German campaign in the Soviet winter of 1941 had been identified before the campaign began. German military-grade engine lubricants were formulated for Central European operational temperature ranges. They thickened significantly below -15 degrees Celsius and became effectively non-functional at -25. Soviet lubricants, formulated for Siberian conditions, remained operational at -40. The Wehrmacht's pre-operational planning had flagged this as a concern. The standard account is that winter equipment was not issued to German troops because Hitler expected a summer victory that would render winter preparations unnecessary, a decision documented in the German Army's equipment requisition and allocation records from the summer of 1941. By October of that year, the Typhoon offensive toward Moscow was stalling in mud, then freezing in temperatures that reached -30 degrees Celsius in some sectors. Panzer III engines that would not turn over in the morning. Soldiers in summer weight uniforms. Oil congealing in transmission housings. The Wehrmacht's logistical and planning failure in the Eastern winter was not an accident of weather. The weather was predictable and predicted. The failure was the decision to proceed anyway. The 4 Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units attached to the advancing German army groups, followed the Wehrmacht's advance into the Soviet Union. Their operational reports, the Ereignismeldungen, were transmitted weekly to Berlin and are preserved in captured German documents at multiple archives. They are formatted as routine operational assessments, situation summary, territorial coverage, statistics. In this format, the administrative format of a military progress report, they record mass shootings with the same column-aligned presentation as supply requisitions or unit movement records. Einsatzgruppe A, operating in the Baltic region and northwestern Russia, reported in its cumulative statistics for the first 3 months of operation a total exceeding 229,000 people killed. This figure appears in a document formatted like a military progress report. The formatting is not accidental. It is the operational expression of the linguistic deformation that Klemperer was documenting simultaneously in Dresden. Violence administered through bureaucratic form acquires, in its documentation, the character of administrative routine. The Wehrmacht's relationship to Einsatzgruppen operations, the question of how much regular German army units knew, witnessed, enabled, or directly participated in the killing operations, was bitterly and consequentially contested for decades after the war. The clean Wehrmacht narrative, the post-war German military mythology that the regular army had fought a professional war while the SS conducted ideological crimes, was the dominant public account in West Germany throughout the 1950s and 60s. The 1995 exhibition Vernichtungskrieg, War of Extermination, presented photographic and documentary evidence of regular Wehrmacht participation that produced a genuine public crisis in Germany. A subsequent historical review found that some specific photographs in the exhibition had been misattributed, but the corrected exhibition of 2001, drawing on verified archival sources, confirmed that Wehrmacht units routinely provided logistical support, security cordons, and in documented instances, direct participation in killing operations. The 1995 exhibition's specific attributions were imperfect. Its fundamental argument was confirmed. These are different things, and both need to be stated clearly. General Erich Hoepner, commanding Panzer Group 4, issued an order to his troops on the 2nd of May, 1941, 6 weeks before Barbarossa began, describing the coming campaign as the ancient struggle of the Germanic peoples against Slavdom, and the defense of European culture against Muscovite Asiatic flooding. This document was not issued in response to a directive from Hitler or the OKW. It was issued spontaneously from a professional military commander, expressing an ideological framework he had apparently arrived at independently. This detail matters for the historical argument about the Wehrmacht's complicity, because it demonstrates that the exterminatory ideology of the Eastern Campaign was not purely a top-down imposition on an otherwise neutral professional military culture. It was, in at least this documented case, already present in the command level before any specific order required it. The ideology didn't contaminate the Wehrmacht. In some parts of the Wehrmacht, it was already there. When I cross-reference the Barbarossa fuel assessment with the operational distances actually covered in the first weeks of the campaign, the numbers are striking in a specific way. By mid-July 1941, German forces had advanced in some sectors by approximately 600 kilometers, already approaching the fuel planning limit. The campaign's pace in its first weeks appeared to confirm the optimistic projections. What it was actually doing was consuming reserves at the projected rate against an enemy that, although suffering catastrophic losses, was not collapsing as the plan had assumed. The Wehrmacht's own internal intelligence assessments from July and August 1941 record, with increasing concern, that Soviet reserve mobilization was producing new formations faster than existing ones were being destroyed. The plan had assumed the Soviet Union had a fixed military inventory that could be exhausted. The Soviet Union had a mobilization capacity that the German intelligence estimate had significantly underestimated. The plan was wrong about the essential variable. The Soviet rail gauge problem is one of those operational details that is technically unglamorous and strategically enormous. Soviet railways used a track gauge of 1,520 millimeters, 85 millimeters wider than the European standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters used by the German rolling stock that would supply the advance. Every kilometer of Soviet track captured by the Wehrmacht was, logistically, unless for German supply trains, until it had been regauged. German railway engineer units regauged approximately 11,500 kilometers of Soviet track by the end of 1941, an extraordinary operational achievement that receives almost no attention in standard accounts. But the pace of advance consistently outstripped the pace of regauging, meaning the supply line was permanently operating behind the front line's needs. Trucks bridged the gap, partially, but trucks need fuel that the supply system was already struggling to deliver. The logistics of Barbarossa were a cascade of compounding deficits, each one manageable in isolation, collectively unsustainable. The German advance on Moscow stalled definitively in December 1941 when Soviet counterattacks, coordinated by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and drawing on fresh Siberian divisions transferred from the Soviet Far East after Soviet intelligence indicated Japan would not attack, pushed German forward positions back from their closest approach to the Soviet capital. German units at this point were, in some cases, within sight of the Moscow suburbs. They could not advance further and could not adequately defend the positions they held. The logistics had failed. The winter equipment had not arrived. The lubricants were wrong. The plan had been constructed on the assumption of a summer decision, and the summer decision had not come. Hitler dismissed Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the German army on the 19th of December, 1941, and assumed personal command of the German army. It was the moment the military professional leadership's formal control over operational decisions was overridden. The moment the oath of the 2nd of August, 1934, arrived, for the German High Command as a lived professional reality rather than an administrative formality. The operational records from the Eastern Front's first 6 months are the most complete detailed military archive of any campaign of comparable scale in modern history. A consequence of the German military's administrative thoroughness, which produced documentation for every level of the operation from OKW down to battalion. Those documents are distributed across archives in Freiburg, Moscow, Washington, and multiple smaller collections. They record, with the flat precision of professional military administration, the progressive accumulation of the campaign's failures, the fuel gaps, the maintenance crises, the intelligence miscalculations, the logistical impossibilities executed by exhausted men who had been told this would be over in 8 weeks. The documents don't argue with each other about the outcome. They simply record what was available and what was needed, day by day, until the two numbers no longer had any useful relationship. Chapter 11. The Wannsee Protocol. The 20th of January, 1942. Am Großen Wannsee, number 56 through 58, on the southwestern edge of Berlin. The address is a villa, solidly bourgeois, lakeside, the kind of property that communicates established wealth without ostentation. It is late morning. 15 men are seated around a table. They have come from the SS, the Foreign Office, the Justice Ministry, the Occupied Eastern Territories Ministry, the Nazi Party Chancellery, and several other governmental bodies. The meeting has been called by Reinhard Heydrich. His deputy, Adolf Eichmann, will take the minutes. The document Eichmann produces, known as the Wannsee Protocol, was originally distributed in 30 copies. Copy number 16, found by Allied investigators in 1947 among Foreign Office files, is 15 pages long. The first page lists the attendees. Of the 15 men around that table, 8 hold doctoral degrees. The meeting, by Eichmann's own post-war testimony, lasted approximately 90 minutes. It began, the protocol records, with a discussion of the conference's agenda. There is no record of any dissent at any point in the proceedings. The killing had already been underway for 6 weeks. The Helmno extermination camp in occupied Poland had begun operations on the 8th of December, 1941, 43 days before the Wannsee Conference. The Einsatzgruppen had been operating since June. The Ereignismeldungen reporting their activities had been circulating through the relevant government departments for months. The Wannsee Conference was therefore not, in the most technically precise sense, the decision point for the Holocaust. The decision, or rather, the accumulation of decisions, authorized through channels that the historical record has not reduced to a single date-stamped order, had already been implemented in the field. What Wannsee provided was coordination, a meeting at which the relevant governmental departments synchronized their roles, resolved jurisdictional questions, and established the administrative framework for extending a program already in progress to its full continental scope. This distinction between decision and coordination is not a mitigating one. It is, if anything, more disturbing, because it means the genocide was sufficiently institutionalized by January 1942 that it required a coordination meeting rather than an authorization meeting. The protocol's listing of the Jewish population of every European country, including nations not under German control at the time, is one of the document's most chilling passages and one of the least discussed. Britain, 330,000. Ireland, 4,000. Sweden, 8,000. Spain, 6,000. Portugal, 3,000. These are not records of completed operations. They are planning figures, a continental inventory of the program's remaining scope, including populations in countries that Germany had not conquered and might never conquer. The ambition documented in those columns is not bounded by operational reality. It is bounded only by the outer limit of what the men around the table believed was, in principle, achievable. 11 million people across 31 countries, listed by nation with decimal point precision. The document is formatted like a planning spreadsheet. It is planning, in the most literal sense, a document that specifies what remains to be done. The intentionalist versus functionalist historiographical debate arrives at its most concentrated form in the question of what the Wannsee Conference represents. Intentionalist historians, Lucy Davidovitz, Gerald Fleming, and others who argue that Hitler had a coherent plan for Jewish extermination, dating from the 1920s, would read Wannsee as the administrative crystallization of a predetermined ideological goal. Functionalist historians, Hans Mommsen, Martin Brosat, argue that the Holocaust emerged from the chaotic interaction of competing bureaucratic imperatives in a polycratic state, without a single identifiable decision point traceable to Hitler's direct order. The Wannsee Protocol itself is genuinely ambiguous as evidence for either position. It is a coordination document, which supports the functionalist reading. If there had been a clear top-down directive, there would be less need for a coordination meeting among equals. But it coordinates explicitly stated exterminatory goals, which supports the intentionalist reading. The men in that room are not discussing something new. They are discussing the administrative management of something already in progress and already understood. The protocol does not resolve the debate. It sits precisely at the intersection of the two arguments, which may be the most honest place for it to be. Adolf Eichmann, who wrote the minutes and was responsible for the document's distribution, fled to Argentina after the war. He was located by Israeli intelligence and captured in Buenos Aires in May 1960, brought to Israel, tried in Jerusalem, and executed in May 1962. His trial was remarkable for a number of reasons, including its duration, its documentation, and the extraordinary circumstance of a defendant who seemed to understand himself, genuinely, as a man who had done a job rather than committed a crime. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, developed from her observations the concept she called the banality of evil. The argument that the Holocaust was largely administered not by ideological fanatics, but by functionaries who had normalized their participation in mass murder through the incremental bureaucratic processes by which they had been recruited into it. The concept was fiercely contested by other historians and scholars, who argued it risked understating ideological commitment and understating individual moral responsibility. The debate it opened has not closed. What neither side disputes is the basic empirical observation. Eichmann, sitting at his glass booth in Jerusalem, answering questions about deportation schedules and transport logistics, did not look like what people expected a mass murderer to look like. That gap between expectation and reality is the problem that Arendt named, and that the historical profession has been arguing about ever since. I have read the Wannsee Protocol in full on multiple occasions, and I want to be honest about what the experience of reading it is like, because I think it matters for understanding why the document is important in ways beyond its historical function. It takes approximately 18 minutes to read aloud at normal pace. The language is bureaucratic throughout, the regime's characteristic vocabulary of euphemism and administrative abstraction. The words murder and killing do not appear. The phrase special treatment appears. The phrase evacuation appears. The phrase working to the east appears. The meaning of these phrases is unambiguous to anyone who reads them in their operational context. Eichmann testified to their meaning directly at his trial, but the language itself performs a specific function. It makes the document readable, at least superficially, as a discussion of a population management program rather than a murder program. The regime understood, as Klemperer had documented from the other side, that the language you use shapes the thoughts you can think while using it. The Wannsee Protocol was written in language designed to make its subject thinkable for the men around the table. It worked. The question of what was known, and where and when, has occupied historians of the Holocaust for decades, partly because it has such direct implications for the question of social and institutional complicity. The Wannsee Protocol was distributed in 30 copies to governmental departments across the Nazi administration. The Ereignismeldungen reporting Einsatzgruppen activities were distributed more widely still, to senior SS, military, and governmental recipients. The deportation transports moved on the Reich's railway network, with schedules coordinated through the Reich Railway's normal administrative channels. The camps were administered through a bureaucratic hierarchy, with documented reporting lines. The Holocaust was not a secret in the sense of being unknown to the institutions of German governance. It was a secret in the sense of being officially undiscussed in public, while being administratively present throughout the governmental apparatus. This distinction matters for understanding how a genocide can be simultaneously occurring and officially unacknowledged in a modern administrative state. Of the 15 men who attended the Wannsee Conference, 8 survived the war. Of those 8, 1 was sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment, then further reduced. Several received sentences of between 6 and 12 years, and were released within 3 to 4 years of sentencing. The administrative architects of the Holocaust, the men who had sat around that lakeside table discussing 11 million people, received in most cases less severe sentences than the individuals who physically carried out the killings, partly because their role was administrative rather than physical, and therefore harder to tie to specific criminal acts under the legal framework available. Martin Luther of the Foreign Office, the most junior senior official present, was later imprisoned by the SS for unrelated political reasons and died in Berlin in 1945 before the war's end. Eichmann was executed in 1962. The others lived out varying post-war existences, some in prison for short periods, several in professional life under assumed identities, at least one in a position of municipal governance in West Germany for several years after the war. The copy of the Wannsee Protocol that survives, number 16 of the original 30, was found in Foreign Office files by American investigators in 1947. The other 29 copies are unaccounted for. Whether they were destroyed, buried, misfiled, or lost in the chaos of 1945 is unknown. The document that survives does so by accident. It was in files that a Foreign Office official had not gotten around to destroying. The specific administrative process by which one copy of 30 was preserved, while 29 were not, is itself a kind of document. It tells you that the archive of the worst administrative act in recorded history survives, in its most concentrated form, because of the specific chaos of a regime in collapse, not because of any preserving intention. The copy in the Foreign Office file was overlooked. What was overlooked became the evidence. Chapter 12, Stalingrad, the 300,000. The 22nd of November, 1942, somewhere on the steppe east of the Don River, in temperatures already dropping toward -20°C, the German Sixth Army, approximately 230,000 men, along with Romanian and other Axis formations bringing the total encircled to something approaching 300,000, has just been surrounded. Two Soviet armored pincers have met at the town of Kalak on Don, closing a pocket that German Army Group B's intelligence staff had been warning about for weeks. The operational warning had been filed, it had been assessed, and then, in the organizational logic of a command structure that had been rewarded for optimism and punished for caution, it had been weighted less heavily than the assumption that Soviet operational capacity was insufficient to execute what it had just executed. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, transmitted a radio message to Army High Command. He reported the situation. He requested permission to break out to the southwest before the ring solidified. The request was transmitted. The response came back through channels, ultimately expressing Hitler's position. The Sixth Army would hold. It would become a fortress. It would be supplied by air. The quartermaster report from the Sixth Army, dated the 18th of December, 1942, captured by Soviet forces and held at the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow, records the daily ration for encircled soldiers at that point in the siege: 200 grams of bread, 20 grams of fat, 120 grams of meat, primarily horse. The Wehrmacht's own minimum combat ration standard was 3,600 calories per day. The December 18th ration provided approximately 1,490 calories. The deficit, roughly 2,110 calories per day, per man, for approximately 230,000 men, is the central arithmetic of Stalingrad. It is not a dramatic figure, it is a functional figure, describing the gap between what a human body requires to maintain physical capacity and what these specific human bodies were receiving. A body operating at 40% of its caloric requirement degrades in ways that are predictable, progressive, and, without intervention, irreversible. The Soviet ring had made intervention impossible. The arithmetic was doing what arithmetic does. The Luftwaffe airlift that Göring had promised would sustain the pocket was, from its inception, physically impossible to deliver at the promised rate. The promise was 500 tons of supplies per day. The delivery, averaged across the period from the 25th of November to the 15th of January, was approximately 94 tons per day, 18.8% of the promised figure. The Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft assigned to the operation had a payload capacity of approximately 1 8/10 tons under winter operational conditions. To deliver 500 tons per day would have required approximately 278 successful round-trip sorties daily, sustained through Soviet fighter opposition, anti-aircraft fire, winter weather, and the progressive mechanical exhaustion of a transport fleet already overextended from prior Eastern Front operations. The Luftwaffe had approximately 200 Ju-52 aircraft assigned to the airlift at its peak. The arithmetic of the promised 500 tons was not optimistic. It was impossible. Göring knew the aircraft numbers. He knew the payload figures. He promised 500 tons anyway. The question of whether this was self-deception or deliberate misrepresentation is one the documents cannot answer definitively. The outcome was the same either way. General Friedrich Paulus transmitted multiple requests for permission to break out of the encirclement in the weeks following the pocket's closure. The most detailed of these, transmitted in late November, preserved in German military communications records, outlines the Sixth Army's fuel and ammunition state and the operational timeline within which a breakout might be feasible. Hitler's responses, transmitted through Army High Command and recorded in the Führer Conference stenograms, consistently denied permission. Operation Winter Storm, the relief attempt by Army Group Dawn under Erich von Manstein, came within approximately 48 kilometers of the encircled army in mid-December before being stopped by Soviet forces. Paulus again requested permission to break out toward the relief column. The permission was refused. The operational question of whether a breakout was, by mid-December, actually achievable, given the Sixth Army's fuel reserves and the weather, is genuinely contested. David Glantz's analysis of Soviet operational strength suggests the breakout attempt might have resulted in the open-step destruction of the Sixth Army rather than its rescue. Hitler's order was criminal in its disregard for 300,000 men. Whether it was more militarily catastrophic than the alternatives is a separate question, and historians who agree on virtually everything else about this campaign disagree about it. On the 31st of January 1943, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, a promotion transmitted by radio to the pocket with what amounted to a historical footnote attached. No German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. The implication was unambiguous. Paulus surrendered the southern pocket on the 31st of January anyway. The northern pocket, under General Karl Strecker, continued resistance until the 2nd of February. Paulus was the first German field marshal to surrender in the field. Hitler's response, recorded in the Führer Conference stenogram from the 1st of February, is a document of operational and psychological collapse, extended, incoherent, cycling between fury at Paulus's personal failure and calculations about what the surrender would mean for the war's continuation. The stenogram is not the record of a military commander processing a setback. It is the record of a man who had built a strategic and psychological architecture on the premise of infallibility, encountering evidence that the architecture was wrong. Of the roughly 91,000 men who survived to surrender at Stalingrad, approximately 6,000 returned to Germany, most of them not until 1955, 12 years after the surrender, when the Soviet Union repatriated the final prisoners under an agreement with the newly established West German government. The rest died in Soviet captivity, principally from disease and the effects of long-term malnutrition. The caloric mathematics that had been operating inside the pocket continued, in diminished form, in the camps. The Soviet prisoner mortality rate for Germans captured at Stalingrad was approximately 93%. In the German prison camps that had processed Soviet prisoners since 1941, the mortality rate had been comparable or higher, the product of deliberate starvation, exposure, and systematic neglect that is documented in German camp administration records. Both prisoner death rates are in the record. Both are in the history. They don't cancel each other out. They accumulate. I find myself thinking, when I work through the Stalingrad quartermaster records, about the specific nature of a calculable catastrophe, one where the outcome was not uncertain, but was, in principle, computable. Someone with a supply table and a ration schedule in late November 1942 could have projected the date of the Sixth Army's operational collapse to within approximately 2 weeks of the actual surrender date. The calculation required no intelligence about Soviet operations, no prediction of weather, no assessment of tactical variables. It required only arithmetic, caloric intake, minimum functional caloric requirement, number of men, rate of degradation. The number of people who performed that calculation, and the number who then communicated it upward with sufficient clarity and persistence to affect the decision-making, are not the same number. The gap between those two figures is, for me, one of the defining measurements of how the Nazi command system functioned, in practice, during the war's middle years. The families of Sixth Army soldiers began receiving the official notifications in early and mid-February 1943. The German government's handling of the Stalingrad defeat, the 3 days of official mourning, the radio broadcasts, the controlled public language of heroic sacrifice, is documented in the propaganda ministry's internal files, which show Goebbels working through multiple drafts of the public messaging with unusual care. The defeat was too large to suppress and too devastating to minimize. The messaging that emerged, Stalingrad as sacrifice rather than failure, the dead as the saviors of European civilization, rather than the victims of a command decision, was adopted and sustained for the remainder of the war. The SD morale reports from February and March 1943, held at the Bundesarchiv, show that the public response to Stalingrad was different from any prior news of the war, quieter, more withdrawn, less responsive to the official framing than previous setbacks had been. The German public did not stop believing in February 1943, but something had shifted in the quality of their belief, a shift that no official messaging could fully reverse. Friedrich Paulus, after his capture, eventually cooperated with Soviet-backed organizations calling for German military resistance to Hitler. He testified at the Nuremberg trials. After his release from Soviet captivity in 1953, he settled in East Germany rather than the West, a decision that reflected both his relationship with his Soviet captors and his awareness that his reception in West Germany would likely be complicated. He wrote, lectured, and gave interviews, attributing the Stalingrad catastrophe primarily to Hitler's command decisions. He died in Dresden in 1957, 14 years after surrendering in the pocket whose name he would carry forever. He was never tried for war crimes. The Sixth Army's conduct in the Soviet Union, the Army's role in the broader Eastern Campaign, including its relationship to Einsatzgruppen operations in its operational area, was not the subject of any sustained legal proceeding specifically focused on his command. He died, as he had lived the last years of his life, in the specific moral ambiguity of a professional soldier who had served an exterminatory regime, and attributed the consequent catastrophe entirely to the regime's political leadership. Chapter 13. The Bomb Under the Table. The 20th of July, 1944, 0940 hours. The Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Forward Command Headquarters complex in the forests of East Prussia, near the town of Rostenburg. It is summer, and it is hot, which is why the regular morning briefing is being held not in the underground concrete bunker that most people picture when they imagine this location, but in a wooden barracks building above ground, its windows open to catch the July air. The building's construction is functional rather than fortified. Wooden walls, a concrete floor, a heavy oak briefing table supported by two solid trestle-style legs. Approximately 20 men are present for the Situation Conference. Among them is Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, recently appointed Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Reserve Army, a position that has given him regular access to Hitler's headquarters, which is why he is in the room. Under his left arm, he lost his right arm, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye to a strafing attack in Tunisia in 1943. He is carrying a briefcase. The briefcase contains a bomb. The briefcase held a British-supplied plastic explosive charge of the type designated 808 compound, delivered to the German resistance through intelligence channels. Stauffenberg had intended to arm 2 separate explosive packages, approximately 4 kilograms total, but had been interrupted during the arming process in an anteroom and had time to activate only the first package, approximately 2 kilograms. He placed the briefcase beneath the heavy oak conference table, positioned to the right of one of the trestle legs, as close to Hitler's position as he could manage without attracting attention. He then excused himself from the briefing on the pretext of a telephone call. The detonator he had activated was a British time pencil chemical fuse, a glass capsule of acid, when crushed, that corrodes a wire retaining a spring-loaded striker. The corrosion rate is temperature-dependent. At the ambient temperature of the barracks building that morning, the available documentation suggests the fuse would fire in approximately 10 to 14 minutes. Stauffenberg had approximately 4 minutes from his departure to the detonation as he walked toward the airfield. The bomb went off at 12:42 hours. At some point between Stauffenberg's departure from the briefing room and the detonation, the exact moment is not precisely established in surviving records. Another officer at the table, finding the briefcase inconveniently positioned near his feet, moved it. He placed it on the other side of the trestle leg from where Stauffenberg had left it. The post-war structural assessment of the conference room, conducted by American military engineers in August 1945, established the significance of this with physical precision. The briefing table's solid oak construction was approximately 9 centimeters thick. The trestle leg was a heavy structural element. The briefcase, relocated to the outside of the trestle leg, was now separated from Hitler's position at the table by 9 centimeters of oak and 1 full structural trestle. The explosive detonated. The room was destroyed. 4 men in the room died from their wounds. Hitler survived with a perforated eardrum, minor burns, and shock. The distance between the briefcase's original position and the position to which it was moved is not precisely documented in the surviving records, but the engineering assessment's conclusion that the trestle leg absorbed the primary overpressure wave makes the physical mechanism clear. The margin of survival was a wooden table leg. The July 20th plot was not, as it is sometimes presented, the product of a spontaneous crisis of conscience among the German military leadership in the war's final phase. It was the outcome of a resistance network that had been operating for years, developing operational plans, recruiting participants, and surviving the constant threat of Gestapo penetration. Henning von Tresckow, who served on the Army Group Center staff on the Eastern Front and was one of the most operationally committed members of the resistance, had been attempting to kill Hitler since at least early 1943. In March of that year, Tresckow and his adjutant Fabian von Schlabrendorf had smuggled a bomb onto Hitler's aircraft, disguised as a package of Cointreau bottles, placed in the cargo hold by an aide. The bomb failed to detonate. The detonator froze in the unheated cargo hold at altitude. Schlabrendorf traveled to Hitler's headquarters the following day, retrieved the package from the aircraft while it sat live, disassembled it in a train compartment on the return journey, and returned the British explosive to resistance channels for future use. His own account of this, written after the war, describes the retrieval with a degree of controlled understatement that makes it, in context, one of the most remarkable pieces of personal narrative the resistance produced. The Valkyrie operational plan, the mechanism by which the resistance intended to seize control of the German state following Hitler's death, had a specific organizational ingenuity that deserves attention. Valkyrie was an existing Wehrmacht contingency plan for mobilizing the reserve army to suppress domestic civil unrest. Foreign workers rioting, SS units acting against civilian authority, that kind of scenario. The resistance conspirators, working within the Army High Command, had modified the plan's operational orders so that, on the triggering signal, the reserve army would move to secure governmental and SS facilities in Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and Paris, effectively inverting the plan's original purpose. Instead of the army suppressing unrest, the army would become the vehicle for removing the SS and the party apparatus. The modification was done using forged authorization in Hitler's name. The plan was operationally sophisticated enough that, on the afternoon of the 20th of July, before it became clear that Hitler had survived, reserve army units in Berlin and Wehrmacht forces in Paris actually began executing the orders. General Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel in Paris arrested approximately 1,200 SS and SD personnel. For several hours that afternoon, there was a functioning post-Hitler military administration operating in Paris. It lasted until a telephone call from Berlin confirmed that the Führer was alive. The Resistance's operational plan required, as its essential first condition, Hitler's death. When that condition was not met, the plan had no path forward. The conspirators in the Bendler block in Berlin, the Army High Command facility where the post-assassination government was to have been established, found themselves executing orders for a coup whose fundamental premise had been negated. The question of when they knew and how their decision-making proceeded after they knew is one of the points of genuine source conflict in the historical record. Werner von Heften's statement, given under Gestapo interrogation, and therefore subject to the reliability problems of testimony extracted under duress, suggests Stauffenberg believed until approximately 1600 hours that Hitler was dead. But communication records from the Bendler block show that ambiguous reports about the explosion's outcome were reaching Berlin by early afternoon. Both accounts may contain partial truth. It is plausible that Stauffenberg chose to believe the assassination had succeeded, while the evidence remained ambiguous, because the alternative was operational paralysis. To me, the engineering report matters more than the conventional romantic narrative of the plot, because it removes the question from the domain of fate and places it squarely in the domain of contingency. The conventional treatment of July 20th often carries an undertone of inevitability, the suggestion that the plot was doomed, that the regime's end could only come from external military defeat, that internal resistance was never a viable mechanism for the war's early conclusion. The engineering report doesn't support that reading. The mechanism was sound. The explosive was adequate. The placement was correct. One anonymous officer moved a briefcase. That specific act, the act of an unnamed man who wanted more room for his feet under a conference table, determined that the war would continue for 10 more months, that the air war over Germany would continue, that the death camps would continue, that the Red Army would reach Berlin rather than a post-Hitler German government negotiating terms. The physics are as clear as physics can be. The moral weight of the physics is something else entirely. The executions following July 20th were, in both scale and method, the regime's response to what it correctly understood as an existential challenge from within its own institutions. Stauffenberg and 3 other leading conspirators were shot in the Bendler Block courtyard in the early hours of the 21st of July. Treschow shot himself on the Eastern Front on the 21st, having heard that the assassination had failed. Over the following months, the Gestapo and the SS worked through the resistance network with the systematic thoroughness that characterized their best investigative work. Approximately 7,000 people arrested, approximately 200 executed, the remainder subject to imprisonment, and in many cases, the Sippenhaft policy, under which family members of conspirators were also arrested. The children of some conspirators were taken and placed in homes under changed names. The regime's response to the plot lasted longer than many of the regime's military campaigns. The innere Führung, leadership by conscience, doctrine that is now the foundational principle of the German Bundeswehr's military ethics framework, was developed in the 1950s, specifically as a legislative and institutional response to the moral situation that the July 20th conspirators had faced. The doctrine establishes that a German soldier's primary obligation is to the legal and constitutional order, not to any individual commanding authority, and that a soldier has not only the right, but the duty to refuse orders that violate legal or moral norms. It is the legal inversion of the oath of the 2nd of August, 1934, the document that had been designed to make what Stauffenberg did legally impossible. The men and women who drafted the innere Führung doctrine knew what they were doing. They were writing the law that the July 20th plotters should have had available. The German military has been teaching it to its officers ever since. Chapter 14. The Miracle Weapons and the Slave Pits. September 1943. Underground, in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, in a tunnel complex carved from gypsum bedrock by hands that did not belong to engineers. The tunnels are called the Middle Work, the Central Works, and they stretch approximately 3.6 kilometers through the mountain. 2 primary galleries connected by 46 cross passages, each main tunnel approximately 8 meters wide and 7 meters high. The air inside is thick with gypsum dust, and the particulate from the pneumatic drills being driven by prisoners from the nearby Dora concentration camp. The ventilation system is inadequate. The mortality during the tunnel construction phase, September 1943 through approximately March 1944, runs at an estimated 60 deaths per day, primarily from respiratory disease, exhaustion, and the particular category of institutional violence that concentration camp records document under the bureaucratic heading of special treatment. What is being built inside this mountain, by these men under these conditions, is the most technically sophisticated weapon in the German arsenal. What is being spent to build it is something else entirely. The V-2 rocket, the Aggregate 4, or A4 in its developmental designation, was, by the technical standards of the early 1940s, an extraordinary engineering achievement. It stood 14 meters tall, weighed approximately 12.5 tons at launch, and was powered by a liquid oxygen and ethanol engine, producing 25 metric tons of thrust. It was capable of reaching an altitude of approximately 80 kilometers, the recognized lower boundary of space, and striking targets up to 320 kilometers distant. It was the world's first operational ballistic missile. Its development, led by Werner von Braun and his team at the Peenemünde Research Facility on the Baltic coast, represented a genuine frontier of applied physics and engineering. The guidance system, the fuel turbopump, the re-entry vehicle design, each of these was a problem that had never been solved at operational scale before. The team that solved them was talented, well-resourced, and working at the leading edge of what was technically possible. It was also, by any strategic calculus that the German armaments establishment's own analysts could construct, almost entirely irrelevant to the war's outcome. The V-2's warhead weighed 975 kilograms, less than the bomb load of a single RAF Lancaster bomber operating over German cities. Its guidance system's circular error probable was approximately 4 kilometers. It would reliably hit its target city, but could not reliably hit any specific building within that city. Each rocket cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly 20 times the cost of conventional artillery, delivering equivalent explosive payload to equivalent range. The V2 program consumed approximately 13,000 metric tons of liquid oxygen per month at peak production in late 1944. Approximately 15% of Germany's total industrial oxygen production capacity. That was oxygen not available to German hospitals, steel production, or chemical manufacturing. The weapon killed approximately 2,754 civilians in London and Antwerp in its operational deployment. The workers who built it died, according to estimates based on camp mortality records, at a rate exceeding 6,000 during the production period. The weapon killed more people in its manufacture than in its operation. The decision to move V2 production underground, following the Allied bombing of Peenemünde in August 1943, is documented in Albert Speer's ministerial conference records. His approval of the underground transfer appears in a 4-line administrative note. The note specifies the production target, the facility designation, and the authorization. It does not specify the labor source. The labor source was concentration camp prisoners transferred from Buchenwald to the newly established Dora camp, the Mittelbau-Dora complex, in September 1943. The connection between the administrative note and the mortality rates in the tunnel construction phase is present in the documentary record. Both documents are in accessible archives. Their chronological and institutional relationship is traceable, and the supply chain between Speer's production authorization and the specific deaths in Tunnel Section B of the Mittelwerk is not a matter of historical inference. It is a matter of administrative record. The typed work assignment roster for December 1943, Tunnel Section B, held at the Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora Memorials Foundation archive, contains the mortality column I described at the opening of this chapter, the dagger entries. In 1 month, in one section of one tunnel, 34 men died out of 847 listed. That specific figure is what I want to hold here, rather than the larger cumulative statistics, because the roster's formatting makes the individual entry visible in a way that aggregate statistics do not. Each dagger is a typed character on a specific line, next to a prisoner number, in a column that otherwise contains letters denoting work capacity. The administrative precision with which the deaths were recorded, categorized, entered, filed, is continuous with the same administrative precision that ran through every level of the regime's operations. The forms continued, the columns continued, the filing continued. Werner von Braun's wartime record has been the subject of sustained historical investigation for decades, and the conclusions that investigation has reached are not comfortably accommodating of the post-war rehabilitation narrative. He held the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, Major, in the Waffen-SS. Documents show he visited the Mittelwerk facility and the Dora camp on at least 2 occasions during the production period. Post-war testimony from camp survivors described his presence during conditions that could not have concealed the mortality situation from any visitor with professional attention. He was evacuated to American custody in May 1945 under Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientific and technical personnel before the Soviet Union could access them, and subsequently led the American rocket program that produced the Saturn V, the launch vehicle that carried the first humans to the moon in July 1969. His SS rank and his wartime record were classified by the American government for years. He became one of the most publicly celebrated figures in the American space program. He died in Alexandria, Virginia, in June 1977. The U.S. government declassified portions of his Operation Paperclip file in stages over subsequent decades. To me, the Paperclip story is not primarily a story about von Braun as an individual. It is a story about a specific institutional moral calculus, the calculation that technological capability can be worth the amnestying of documented complicity in atrocity. The United States government made this calculation explicitly, with knowledge of what it was doing. The calculation produced the Saturn V. It also produced a specific and documented precedent, that if your technical expertise is sufficiently valuable to a major power, your wartime record is negotiable. That precedent did not die in 1977. It is discussed by name. Operation Paperclip is named. In contemporary ethical debates about government recruitment of technologists with problematic records, in fields ranging from cybersecurity to artificial intelligence. The question has not been resolved. The precedent continues to operate. The Mittelwerk Tunnel complex near Nordhausen is accessible to the public today as the Mittelbau-Dora Memorial. Guided tours move through the main tunnels. The cross passages are still there. The gypsum walls still show the marks of the pneumatic drills. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through the Dora camp during its existence. Approximately 20,000 died there, from disease, exhaustion, and the conditions of the tunnel construction and production work. The Peenemünde Research Facility on the German Baltic coast is also a museum, the development site of the weapon whose production killed more people than the weapon itself. The two sites are roughly 300 kilometers apart. The technical achievement and the human cost share the same geography, the same administrative supply chain, and the same bureaucratic authorization trail. They do not share equal prominence in the standard narrative of the German weapons program. They should. The V2 killed 2,754 people in operational deployment. The number is documented through British and Belgian civil defense records. It is precise, cross-referenced, and well-established. The number who died building it, the Mittelwerk workers, is estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000, depending on how broadly the Dora camp's mortality period is defined, and which transfer populations are included. The estimates range reflects the incompleteness of the concentration camp documentation, portions of which were destroyed in the camp's final weeks. The imprecision of the death count is itself a document of how the regime's record-keeping priorities operated. The V2 production statistics are complete and precise. The mortality statistics have gaps. Chapter 15. The Cities and the Fire. Hamburg, Germany. The night of the 27th of July, 1943, 0:50 hours. 729 RAF Lancaster and Halifax bombers are approaching the city from the northwest, in a stream approximately 200 kilometers long. The raid is the third in a series codenamed Operation Gomorrah. The previous raids have already done significant damage to Hamburg's industrial and residential areas. Tonight is different. The density of aircraft over the target area, compressed by navigation instructions into a 50-minute attack window, means that incendiary bombs are landing across a residential district faster than fires can be individually isolated. At approximately 0100 hours, the conditions for a Feuersturm, a firestorm, are met. The physics of what follows are documented in Hamburg civil defense reports at the Hamburg State Archive, and they describe conditions that overwhelmed every emergency protocol the city's administration had established, because no emergency protocol had been written for conditions of this kind, because nothing of this kind had happened before. The RAF Bomber Command Directive, issued on the 14th of February, 1942, reference AIR 14/739, at the National Archives in Kew, contains a paragraph that was classified for years after the war, and whose public revelation, when it came, produced considerable historical and legal controversy. The directive states that the primary objective of bomber operations should be focused on the morale of the enemy civilian population, and in particular of the industrial workers. This is not a sentence about bombing factories or railway marshalling yards or oil refineries. It is a sentence that explicitly designates civilian morale as a military target, which under the legal framework being developed contemporaneously at the relevant international conventions, constitutes, by most legal interpretations, the deliberate targeting of a civilian population. The directive was signed. It was acted upon. The men who signed it were fighting a regime that had bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Coventry. Neither of these facts cancels the other. Both are in the historical record, and both need to be held simultaneously to understand what the strategic bombing campaign actually was. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris to the press, Butcher Harris to some of his own crews, who understood the mortality rates of the bomber offensive more personally than any directive could convey, inherited Bomber Command in February 1942 and shaped it, over 3 years, into the most destructive instrument of air power that had yet been deployed against a civilian population. Harris was not a complicated man in his public positions. He made them clearly, defended them consistently, and never publicly apologized for them before his death. His operational directives, preserved at Q, are distinguished by a specific quality of bureaucratic precision, combined with what can only be described as a professional enthusiasm for the work. He believed that bombing German cities would break German civilian morale, and thereby end the war. He pursued this belief with institutional commitment and personal conviction for 3 years. The evidence for whether the belief was correct is, at the strategic level, genuinely mixed. The Hamburg firestorm's physics were not anticipated by British planners, German civil defense authorities, or anyone else, because a firestorm at this scale had not previously been produced by human action. The mechanism, simultaneous ignition across a wide area, creates a pressure differential between the burning zone, where superheated air rising rapidly creates low pressure at ground level, and the surrounding atmosphere, which remains at normal pressure. This differential generates radial inflow winds, drawing air toward the fire from the surrounding area. Above approximately 200 kilometers per hour, these inflow winds carry burning debris laterally, expanding the fire perimeter faster than any available suppression capacity. The Hamburg Fire Service's own post-incident reports record wind speeds within the firestorm zone reaching 240 kilometers per hour. At that velocity, a person cannot remain standing in the open. Hamburg's civil defense records describe civilians who had taken shelter in cellar spaces dying from oxygen deprivation. The firestorm was consuming the available atmospheric oxygen within the burn zone faster than air could circulate to replace it. Approximately 37,000 to 45,000 civilians died in that single night's operation. The range reflects the difficulty of establishing exact figures in the aftermath of a destruction of that scale. The Dresden operation of the 13th to 15th of February, 1945, is the most contested targeting decision of the entire European air war. And the contestation is not purely academic. It has been actively weaponized in political and propaganda contexts, from the Nazi propaganda of February 1945 to the historical distortions of David Irving in the 1960s and onward. The Nazi government claimed 250,000 dead in the immediate aftermath, a figure constructed for propaganda purposes and unsupported by any census or casualty documentation. David Irving's 1963 book on the Dresden raids claimed 135,000 dead, a figure he arrived at through a methodology that subsequent historians found unsupportable, and that he himself later modified in various directions depending on the context. The Dresden Historical Commission's definitive study, published in 2010 after systematic archival research in German local records, civil defense files, and burial documentation, established the death toll at approximately 22,700 to 25,000. The Commission's methodology is documented, its sources are archived, and its conclusions represent the current scholarly consensus. The gap between the Commission's figure and the figures asserted in various propaganda contexts, Nazi, neo-Nazi, and Irvingite, is not a matter of historiographical nuance. It is a matter of documented falsification. The strategic effectiveness of the area bombing campaign is an argument that serious historians have conducted with documented evidence and reached genuinely different conclusions. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey of 1945 concluded that strategic bombing had significantly disrupted German war production, particularly in the oil campaign's final phase, from mid-1944 onward. Richard Over's archival analysis in War and Economy in the Third Reich demonstrates that German war production actually increased through 1943 and 1944, despite the bombing, a fact documented in Speer's Armaments Ministry production statistics, which suggests the area bombing campaign in its first 2 years did not achieve its stated industrial effect. Both positions have documentary support. The current scholarly synthesis, approximately, is that area bombing from 1942 through 1944 had significant human cost and modest industrial effect, while precision targeting of oil infrastructure from mid-1944 onward had substantial operational effect on German military capacity. This synthesis leaves the area bombing campaign, including Hamburg, Berlin, and the first Dresden raid, in a position where its strategic justification is, at minimum, historically inadequate to its human cost. When I sit with Directive Number 22 and the Hamburg Civil Defense reports simultaneously, I find there isn't a comfortable analytical position available. The directive authorized the deliberate targeting of civilian morale, a legal category with specific content. The Hamburg Civil Defense reports describe its execution in physical detail. The regime those bombers were fighting had bombed Coventry, Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London. It was actively operating extermination camps. It had invaded and devastated most of continental Europe. The men who signed the directive and flew the missions were doing so in the knowledge of what they were fighting, and with genuine belief that what they were doing would shorten the war and thereby reduce total suffering. The legal analysis and the moral analysis and the strategic analysis of the area bombing campaign produced different answers, and I don't think that resolving them into a single clean judgment does justice to the historical complexity of what the documents actually record. Operation Chastise, the dam-buster raid of the 16th and 17th of May, 1943, occupies a specific place in the British popular memory of the air war. Celebrated as a precision operation, technically daring, the kind of story that documentaries and films have returned to repeatedly. The Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb, a cylindrical weapon that skipped across the water surface of the reservoir to detonate against the dam face, was a genuine engineering innovation, and the raid required flying at approximately 18 meters above the reservoir surface in darkness to achieve the correct release geometry. The Mona and Ader dams were breached. The Mona breach released approximately 116 million cubic meters of water into the Ruhr Valley, causing industrial flooding and infrastructure damage. It also killed approximately 1,300 to 1,600 people in the flood path, approximately 800 of whom, according to German local casualty records, were Soviet forced laborers held in camps in the valley downstream from the dam. This fact appears in the German local government records from the aftermath. It does not typically appear in the operational accounts of the raid. Arthur Harris was the only senior Allied commander of the war not issued a campaign medal specifically for his wartime service. Bomber Command was not given a campaign clasp, equivalent to those issued to Fighter Command, Coastal Command, or the land forces. The omission was deliberate, acknowledged privately by the British government, but never publicly explained. Harris received a knighthood and a baronetcy. His crews received general service decorations. The specific decision not to create a Bomber Command campaign medal was taken at the governmental level, without public statement, sometime in the late 1940s. Harris was aware of the omission. He considered it a betrayal of the men he had commanded. He emigrated to South Africa after the war, and returned to Britain only after receiving his baronetcy in 1953. He gave interviews, wrote his memoirs, and defended the campaign consistently until his death in 1984. He never expressed doubt about the campaign's conduct in any documented public statement. The absence of the campaign medal and the absence of public doubt are both in the record. Chapter 16. The Courtroom in the Rubble. Nuremberg, Germany. The 20th of November, 1945. 6 months and 12 days after the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces. The courtroom in the Palace of Justice has been rebuilt. The building was damaged in bombing raids, but its walls stood, and American engineers worked through the autumn to make it functional. It is a large room, but not vast. The elevated bench for the 4 judges, representing the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The prosecution tables arrayed before them, the defense tables to one side, the dock for the defendants. 22 men are in the dock. They include the second in command of the German state, the former foreign minister, the former armaments minister, senior military commanders, propagandists, administrators of occupied territories, the man who was Hitler's designated successor. They have been brought to this room to answer charges under a legal framework that did not exist when most of the acts charged were committed. The American chief prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, rises to give his opening address. It takes several hours. In it, there is a passage he wrote himself on a legal notepad, whose text is preserved at the Library of Congress. The word voluntarily in the passage, describing the Allied decision to submit their captive enemies to the judgment of law, is underlined twice. He knew the claim was contestable. He made it anyway. The 4 counts on which the defendants were charged, conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, contained one count whose legal status was, at the moment of the indictment, genuinely novel. Count 4, crimes against humanity, had no established precedent in international law as a recognized criminal category under which individuals could be held legally liable. The concept had been discussed in the international law literature, most substantively in the work of Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, but it had never been codified in a treaty or tested in an international tribunal. The Nuremberg Charter created it as a prosecutable offense. The German defense team immediately challenged this on the grounds that ex post facto prosecution, applying criminal law retroactively to acts committed before the law existed, violated the foundational principle of nulla poena sine lege, no punishment without prior law, present in every major legal system. The defense argument was not frivolous. It identified a genuine legal tension that the tribunal's judges acknowledged in their deliberations, and it has been discussed by legal scholars ever since. Jackson's answer to the ex post facto argument was not purely technical, it was partly philosophical, and it is worth understanding as such. His position was that the principle underlying crimes against humanity, that a state's systematic murder of its own civilian population, is an international crime, regardless of whether a treaty has codified it, was sufficiently fundamental to international legal norms to have the force of law without formal codification. He was arguing that some acts are so clearly prohibited by the principles underlying civilization that they constitute crimes even in the absence of a statute. This argument has been both enormously influential in the development of international criminal law and persistently contested by legal theorists who argue it grants tribunals the dangerous power to create criminal liability through interpretive fiat. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, one of the most principled voices in American political life in this period, argued publicly in 1946 that the Nuremberg trials were victor's justice, law applied retroactively by the winning side to acts defined as criminal after the fact. His position has been criticized as morally tone-deaf to the scale of what was being prosecuted. It identified a real legal problem. Both things are true. The following orders defense, anticipated as the primary German defense strategy, had been preemptively removed by the Nuremberg Charter's Article 8, which specified that acting under governmental or superior orders did not constitute a defense or a ground for reduction of sentence, though it could be considered in mitigation. The effect of this provision was to require defendants to argue individual moral agency at every point in their testimony, which produced, over the course of the tribunal's 403 days and 42 million words of transcript, some of the most revelatory testimony about institutional complicity in mass violence that any legal proceeding has generated. The defendants could not simply say they followed orders. They had to explain, in documented detail, what they understood they were doing, what choices they believed they had, and why they made the choices they made. The answers are in the record. They are, in varying combinations, self-serving, partially accurate, and historically indispensable. Hermann Göring was the most formidable defendant, intellectually combative, strategically calculating in his presentation, and capable of outmaneuvering prosecution witnesses and cross-examination on multiple occasions during the trial. He understood the proceedings better than most of the other defendants, and he understood that his personal performance in the dock was the last arena in which he could exercise any form of power. He performed with considerable skill. The prosecution's evidence against him was nevertheless comprehensive. Command authority over the Luftwaffe through the bombing of Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Coventry. Administrative authority over the Aryanization process. Presiding over the November 12th conference in which the billion Reichsmark atonement fine was assessed against German Jews. He was convicted on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. He died by cyanide suicide in his cell on the 15th of October, 1946, 2 hours before his scheduled execution. The source of the cyanide capsule was the subject of an extensive American Army investigation that reached no definitive conclusion. Multiple theories have been advanced: a sympathetic guard, a capsule concealed in a personal item during the preceding months, and none has been proven. The most powerful surviving figure of the Third Reich died on his own terms, in his own time, by his own choice. The investigation file is archived. It ends with an open question. 3 defendants were acquitted: Franz von Papen, former chancellor and ambassador; Hjalmar Schacht, former Reichsbank president; Hans Fritzsche, a senior propaganda ministry official. The acquittals were controversial then, and have remained so. The Soviet judges dissented from all 3. Schacht's acquittal, given his role in financing rearmament, reflected the tribunal's conclusion that economic policy, however central to Germany's war-making capacity, could not be straightforwardly converted into criminal liability under the available charge categories. Papin's acquittal reflected the difficulty of establishing criminal liability for the specific acts of political maneuver through which he had facilitated Hitler's appointment. The acquittals are part of the Nuremberg record in the same way the convictions are. They document not only what the tribunal found proven, but what the legal framework could and could not reach. When I look at the list of people who were not in the Nuremberg dock, not because they were acquitted, but because they were never brought to trial, the picture of what Nuremberg achieved and what it didn't becomes clearer. Himmler was dead, by his own hand, in British custody. Hitler was dead in Berlin. Bormann was tried in absentia, convicted, sentenced to death, and remained missing until skeletal remains were identified in West Berlin in the 1970s, subsequently confirmed by DNA analysis in the 90s. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz physician whose experiments on prisoners are documented in camp records and survivor testimony, escaped through the rat lines to South America and died in Brazil in 1979, never brought to trial. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, responsible for documented atrocities in occupied France, escaped similarly and was located in Bolivia in the 1970s, extradited to France, tried, and convicted of crimes against humanity in 1987, 42 years after the events charged. Eichmann in 1962, Barbie in 1987. The Nuremberg proceedings did not exhaust the legal reckoning, they began it. The 42 million words of the Nuremberg transcript are preserved in their entirety and are publicly accessible in English and German. The 300,000 affidavits reviewed by the tribunal are substantially archived. The captured German documents presented in evidence, approximately 100,000 of them, form the core of the collections that would subsequently be distributed to various national archives and research institutions. The evidentiary problem at Nuremberg was not that the evidence was insufficient, it was that the evidence was so voluminous that selection became the primary challenge. Deciding which documents, of the hundreds of thousands available, most precisely establish the specific elements of the charges against specific defendants. The German administrative tradition of thorough documentation, the same tradition that recorded the dagger column in the Mittelwerk roster, that maintained the Wannsee Protocol distribution list, that kept the insurance transaction records from Kristallnacht, had produced, in the captured document collections, the most complete self-incriminating archive of any criminal enterprise in history. The regime documented its own crimes in the filing cabinets that Allied soldiers opened in 1945. Jackson's opening address is still read, in full, in international law courses at universities across the world. The specific passage about the great nations staying the hand of vengeance and submitting to the judgment of law is, in those courses, simultaneously cited as the founding statement of international criminal law, and subjected to the critique that Taft had articulated in 1946, that the stated ideal was not fully reflected in the proceeding's actual legal structure. Both uses are legitimate. The address is, honestly appraised, a document that describes something that was not quite true, as if it were true, in the service of establishing an institution that has become genuinely important. The International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute in 2002, is the direct institutional descendant of the Nuremberg framework. The same definitions of crimes against humanity, the same individual criminal responsibility doctrine, the same standards for establishing systematic targeting. In 2026, the ICC is adjudicating genocide cases in multiple conflicts. The legal tools it is using were invented, under pressure, in a rebuilt courtroom in Nuremberg in 1945, by a team that had approximately 6 months to work out the details of an entirely new area of international law. They were imperfect. They were also the only thing that existed. Chapter 17. What Remains. Frankfurt am Main, West Germany. The summer of 1958. In the offices of the Hessian State Prosecution Service, a man named Fritz Bauer is reading files. He is 54 years old, compact and intense, a social democrat who was imprisoned by the Nazis in the early 1930s and spent the war years in Danish and Swedish exile. He returned to Germany in 1949, worked his way through the West German legal system, and was appointed state prosecutor of Hesse in 1956. He is now reading investigative files concerning a group of men who had served in German mobile killing units on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 42, and who are currently living in West Germany, openly, under their own names, with jobs, families, and in some cases, positions of modest civic responsibility. The West German legal authorities have not pursued them. In some cases, the relevant documentation of their wartime activities has been present in accessible archives for years. The files have not been acted upon. Bauer is now acting on them. He is also, through channels he manages with extraordinary care to prevent interception by West German intelligence services, whose personnel include former SS members he cannot trust, providing information to Israeli intelligence about the location of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. He has calculated that West German justice will not prosecute Eichmann if he is brought to Germany. He is probably right. The standard narrative of post-war Germany, as constructed in the 1950s and into the 60s, presented denazification as essentially complete, a process that had identified and removed the criminal elements of the Nazi regime, leaving a functioning democracy with clean institutional foundations. The archival record that has been progressively opened since the 1980s tells a considerably different story. The West German Bundestag passed, between 1949 and 1954, a series of measures that collectively rehabilitated large categories of former Nazi officials. The most consequential was the legislation enacted under Article 131 of the Basic Law, the so-called 131st Law, which reinstated approximately 150,000 former Nazi civil servants in their pension rights and, in many cases, their governmental positions. The law passed with the support of Konrad Adenauer's Christian Democratic Union. The practical political calculation was transparent. 150,000 former civil servants represented a significant constituency, with families and networks extending far beyond their individual votes. The democratic process of the Federal Republic, in its first decade, actively reconstructed one administrative layer of the Nazi state and gave it pension rights. Hans Globke, Adenauer's chief of staff and state secretary in the Federal Chancellery from 1953 to 1963, had been the author of the official legal commentary on the 1935 Nuremberg race laws during the Nazi period. The commentary had been used in German courts to apply racial classification under those laws. It was the interpretive guide that told judges how to administer the legislation. This was documented in publicly accessible records from the Nazi period. It was known to Adenauer's government. Globke was never prosecuted in West Germany. He was tried in absentia in East Germany in 1963, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment, a conviction that the West German government declined to recognize. He received the Grand Cross of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Republic's highest civilian honor. He retired in 1963 and died in 1973. I have spent considerable time with the documentary record of Globke's career, and what I find most revealing is not the fact of his appointment. That can be explained, if not excused, by political calculation, but the award of the Grand Cross. That required a decision. Someone decided it was appropriate. The denazification tribunals, the Spruchkammern, operated in the Western occupation zones between 1945 and 1951 and processed approximately 3,660,000 cases. Of these, approximately 1,667 resulted in classification as major offenders, the most serious category, carrying the severest penalties. The remainder were classified as offenders of lesser categories, fellow travelers, exonerated, or amnestied. The major offender rate was approximately 0.045% of cases processed. This figure has been cited by historians of transitional justice, including Norbert Frey in his study Adenauer's Germany and the Nazi Past, as evidence that the denazification process functioned not as genuine accountability, but as a mechanism for processing and legitimizing the social reintegration of former Nazi participants. Frey's argument is not that the process was entirely cynical. Individual tribunals varied considerably in their seriousness, but that the systemic outcome, 0.045% serious consequence from 3.6 million cases, cannot be reconciled with the historical record of actual participation in Nazi crimes across the German population. The 2012 study commissioned by the German Federal Foreign Office, conducted by a commission of independent historians, documented that approximately 40% of senior foreign ministry officials in the West German ministry during the 1950s had been members of the NSDAP. Some had served in positions directly relevant to the execution of Nazi racial policy. The foreign ministry's own official history, produced internally in the 1980s, had not established this. The ministry had, in effect, written a history of itself that did not accurately reflect its institutional composition in the early Federal Republic. The 2012 Commission's report was received with considerable institutional discomfort and has been discussed in German public life as evidence of the degree to which the clean break narrative of West German democratic founding was institutionally constructed rather than historically accurate. This is not a fringe historical argument. It is the conclusion of a commission the foreign ministry itself commissioned, using the foreign ministry's own archives. Fritz Bauer's pursuit of the Einsatzgruppen cases produced the Ulm Einsatzgruppen trial of 1958, which convicted 10 defendants and demonstrated, against the resistance of Federal Justice Ministry officials who were uncooperative throughout, that former members of mobile killing units were living in West Germany, accessible to prosecution. The trial's immediate consequence was the establishment, in December 1958, of the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg, an institution specifically created, under pressure from Bauer and others, to coordinate prosecutorial investigation of Nazi-era crimes across West Germany. The Ludwigsburg office led, eventually, to the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965. The first major West German prosecution focused specifically on Auschwitz personnel, and to subsequent decades of prosecutorial work that continues, in diminished form, to the present day. Bauer did not build this institutional infrastructure easily. He built it against the active inertia of a West German legal establishment that included enough former Nazi-era personnel to make his work consistently obstructed. He was found dead in his apartment in Frankfurt on the 1st of July, 1968, in his bathtub. The official finding was accidental death by overdose of sleeping medication combined with alcohol. He had received death threats for years. He had been under surveillance by intelligence services, whose personnel he had documented reasons to distrust. In the months before his death, he had been investigating, according to accounts from colleagues, connections between former SS personnel and the West German intelligence apparatus. The Frankfurt prosecutor's investigation of his death was closed without reaching a conclusion of foul play, and no evidence of foul play has been conclusively established in subsequent investigations or in the research produced for the 2015 German film that revisited the case. I cannot tell you he was killed. The documents do not establish it. What I can tell you is that the man who did more than any other person in West Germany to pursue accountability for the Holocaust died under circumstances that were never fully clarified, after years of working inside an institution that contained people with reasons to want his work to stop. Bauer was gay, a fact that was, throughout his career, a specific and concrete legal vulnerability. Paragraph 175, the statute criminalizing male homosexuality, had been in the German legal code since the 19th century, had been strengthened by the Nazis in 1935, and remained in force in West Germany until 1969, the year after Bauer died. The man who most determinedly pursued accountability for the Third Reich spent his working life in a country where his own identity was a criminal offense under a law the Nazis had modified and the Federal Republic had retained. He pursued justice anyway. The law that could have been used against him was reformed the year after he was found dead in his apartment. His name appears on a street in Frankfurt. It does not appear in most general histories of the Third Reich. What remains, in 2026, of the Third Reich is distributed across archives, legal frameworks, memorial sites, institutional personnel files, and the ongoing work of historians, prosecutors, and researchers who continue to process material that the archives have not yet fully released. The Arlsen Archives, formerly the International Tracing Service, hold approximately 30 million documents relating to Nazi persecution and its victims. They were open to researchers in 2007, after decades of restricted access. The processing of their contents is not complete. Documents continue to be located, cataloged, and cross-referenced. The German Federal Archives continue to declassify material. Prosecutorial investigations of former camp personnel continue. German courts have held in recent decades that participation in the administration of an extermination camp can constitute accessory to murder, regardless of whether a defendant can be tied to a specific individual death, a legal expansion of prosecutorial reach that has enabled cases against defendants in their 90s. The last Nuremberg-related prosecution will happen when it happens, not because all the evidence has been found, but because the generation of perpetrators has finally died. The stone from the Flossenburg quarry is still in the Zeppelinfeld pavement in Nuremberg. The tunnels at Mittelbau Dora are still in the Harz Mountains. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles still stands, immaculate, with its fountains now running. Victor Klemperer's diaries are in paperback in 12 languages. The Wannsee Protocol, copy 16 of 30, is in the house of the Wannsee Conference, which is now a memorial and educational center at the same address where 15 men sat for 90 minutes in January 1942. Fritz Bauer's files are at the Frankfurt City Archive. Hans Globke's career documentation is in the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Archive and in the Federal Archive. The fuel logs from the Ardennes in May 1940 are at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. The MIFO bill records are at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. The Commissar Order Distribution Log with its 42 signatures is at the Federal Military Archive. Klemperer's diary entry for the 13th of February 1933, the one about the neighbor who looked away, is in a published edition available in most university libraries. The neighbor's name is not recorded. The neighbor who looked away on the street in Dresden is, in the end, the figure I keep returning to. Not the perpetrators, not the architects, not the diplomats who filed warnings and did nothing. The neighbor. The man who saw someone he had known for 11 years and adjusted his eyes to a point slightly beyond him and walked on. He left no archive. He wrote no memoir. He appears in one diary entry, recorded by the man he failed to see. He represents, in that single small act, the specific and ordinary moral mechanism without which none of the rest of it was possible. The extermination camps required engineers, administrators, guards, and transport logistics. They required the men who signed the Commissar order and the men who executed it. But before any of that, they required the neighbor on the street in Dresden in 1933 who decided, on a February morning, that seeing his neighbor clearly was no longer something he needed to do. The archives record the machinery. The diary records the mechanism. They are the same history. This has been it.